So hey, what's up guys, welcome back to our YouTube channel. So in this video we are gonna see a very interesting crossover between RWBY and Naruto. So in this video we are going to see what if Naruto went to RWBY universe and had team as a wife. So yeah, this is gonna be very interesting video and little bit of harem. So watch till end, and if you are new on this channel then subscribe, and if you want more videos like this then please make sure to leave a like, share, and yeah, without wasting any more time, let's jump right back into the video.
The forest didn't burn the way forests were supposed to burn. There was no gradual spread of flame, no crackling advance from tree to tree, no slow consumption of bark and branch and leaf. One moment the emerald forest was silent, the deep, breathless silence that preceded grim migrations, the kind that made even seasoned huntsmen go still and check their weapons. And then the sky cracked, not metaphorically, not like thunder. The sky above the emerald forest literally cracked, the way ice fractures across a frozen lake. A spiderweb of blinding white lines splitting the pre-dawn darkness for 3 full seconds before the world caught up with what was happening and the shockwave hit. The trees closest to the impact point didn't fall. They were simply gone, vaporized, their absence a perfect circle carved into the forest like a wound. The trees beyond that radius were flattened outward in a radial pattern, pressed into the earth by a force that hit from above and everywhere at once. Birds took flight across a 12-kilometer stretch of vales surrounding countryside. Grim, 3 separate packs of beowulfs ranging across the forest's deeper sections stopped moving entirely. They turned toward the crater. And then, after a long moment of stillness that had no natural explanation, they turned away. They didn't flee. Grim didn't flee. They existed to hunt, to kill, to be drawn toward the negative emotions of humanity like sharks to blood in open water. Fear made them come. Pain made them come. Despair was practically a dinner bell. But whatever had landed in that crater, whatever had torn a hole in the sky and hit the earth hard enough to flatten 100 meters of ancient forest, the Grim wanted no part of it. They melted back into the trees and were gone. Vale's early warning system registered the event as a Class 3 Grim impact, the kind of kinetic signature associated with a large flying Grim striking the ground at terminal velocity. The automated alert woke 3 duty officers at the Huntsman Dispatch Center, who scrambled a 2-person response team on reflex before any of them had fully processed what their instruments were actually showing them. Because a Class 3 Grim impact had a specific energy signature. This wasn't it. "What is that reading?" the senior officer muttered, leaning over her console. The instruments were giving her a heat signature from the crater site that didn't correspond to any Grim category in the database. It wasn't the cold, hostile radiation of a Nevermore or the dense dust, reactive signature of a King Taijutsu. It was warm, steady, biological like a person, but no person produced that much energy. "Get Beacon on the line," she said. "This goes to the headmaster directly?" Ozpin received the call at 4:47 in the morning, standing at his office window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at the lights of Vale below him the way he had stared at the lights of countless cities across countless years. He listened to the duty officer's report without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Is the response team on site?" "En route, sir. Eat 4 minutes." "Tell them not to approach whatever they find until I arrive." He paused. "And cancel the Grim classification. Whatever this is, it isn't that." He set down the cold coffee, picked up his cane, and moved toward the elevator with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that urgency and panic were not the same thing. Glinda Goodwitch was already in the corridor when the doors opened, which meant her own sensors had caught the event. She fell into step beside him without being asked, clipboard in hand, silver eyes sharp above her glasses. "Dust impact?" she asked. "No." "Grim?" "No." "Then what?" Ozpin pressed the button for the ground floor. "That," he said, "is what I intend to find out." The response team found him 40 seconds before Ozpin arrived, and to their considerable credit, they held position exactly as instructed. He was lying face, down at the center of the crater, arms spread, one cheek pressed against scorched earth that was still faintly warm from the impact. He looked young, 17, maybe 18, built with the lean density of someone who had spent years doing something athletic and physical. Muscles defined without being excessive. Hands calloused in patterns neither huntsman had seen before. He was wearing clothes that didn't correspond to any kingdom's standard, dark pants, an orange jacket that had been mostly burned away in the impact, leaving only the collar and portions of the sleeves. Underneath, a mesh undershirt. His hair was blonde, spiky in a way that seemed improbable. And on his cheeks, both of them perfectly symmetrical, were 3 thin lines. Not scars, not tattoos. They looked like they'd always been there. "He's breathing," one of the responders said, crouching 6 feet back. "Slowly, but yeah, breathing. That's not the part that concerns me." The other one said quietly, because the part that concerned him was the symbol on the stranger's stomach, visible through the torn mesh. A spiral, surrounded by concentric rings of characters that no one in Remnant would have recognized as a writing system, glowing with a faint blue, gold light that pulsed in time with the stranger's heartbeat. And surrounding him, at a radius of approximately 4 meters, was a ring of scorched earth from which all dust, even the naturally occurring dust particulates that drifted through the emerald forest, had been pushed away, as if something in him repelled it, as if the world wasn't quite sure what to do with him. Ozpin arrived, surveyed the scene for 30 seconds without speaking, and then crouched with more ease than his cane suggested he should have, examining the seal on the boy's stomach from a careful distance. Glinda stood behind him. "Ozpin, I know. That's not a semblance manifestation. I know. Whatever is generating that energy field, Glinda," he stood slowly, "have him transported to the medical wing. Full quarantine protocols, not because I believe he's dangerous, but because I don't want him startled awake by strangers in an unfamiliar room." He looked at the crater one more time, the impact radius, the absent grim, the faintly glowing seal. "And make sure someone is there when he wakes up. Someone patient." He thought about which of his students might qualify. He thought about a silver-eyed girl with a scythe too large for her frame and a smile too earnest for the world she lived in. "Someone very patient," he amended. He woke up to white. The ceiling was white. The walls were white. The light was white flat, coming from panels set into the ceiling rather than from any window he could identify, and it had none of the warmth of sunlight, none of the familiar quality of firelight or even the blue glow of chakra. It was just light, and it was everywhere, and for 3 full seconds Naruto Uzumaki lay on his back on a surface softer than anything he'd ever slept on and stared at that white ceiling and understood nothing about where he was. Then the memories hit, not gently. The rift, the ceiling array, Kurama's chakra blazing through him like a sun going supernova, not attacking, shielding, wrapping around his soul like a hand closing over something fragile. And then the sensation of being pulled apart and pressed back together simultaneously. The rift swallowing him. The last thing he'd heard being the distant sound of Sakura screaming his name. He sat up too fast. The room tilted. He grabbed the edge of the bed, he was on a bed, that was something at least, and pressed his eyes shut and breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Repeat until the world had edges again. Kurama. He reached inward, the reflex as natural as reaching for a weapon. The channel was there, the pathway he'd worn smooth over years of conversation with the fox, the specific interior space that had been shared territory since the night he'd stared down a giant 9-tailed monster across a landscape of his own subconscious. He reached, and reached, and reached. The space was there. The warmth was there, faint, diffused like embers banked low, but the presence wasn't. The vast, ancient, irritable, secretly fond presence that had been the bedrock of his inner world since birth was gone. Not dead. He was certain of that. He would have felt it, the way you feel a tooth being pulled even through the numbness of shock. But gone in the sense that a river is gone when it floods into the ocean. Still present, impossible to separate. You idiot, he thought, not with anger but with the specific grief of understanding. You complete idiot. You didn't have to do that. The embers that were all that remained of Kurama's distinct consciousness didn't answer. Of course they didn't. But they pulsed once, faint, warm, and Naruto had known the fox long enough to recognize what that meant. Yes, I did. He pressed his hand over the seal on his stomach and sat with that for a moment. Then he looked around the room properly, because the alternative was sitting with the grief until it swallowed him. And Naruto Uzumaki had never been very good at being swallowed. White room. Medical equipment he didn't recognize. Machines with glowing displays showing lines and numbers that meant nothing to him. Instruments made of materials that caught the light in ways he associated with extremely refined dust. Work, though he didn't know that word yet. A window to his left, showing a view of green grounds and, in the distance, a structure of towers and high arching bridges that could only be a major institution of some kind. A school, maybe? The architecture was simultaneously more and less advanced than anything he'd seen at home. No sense of the organic flow of hidden village construction, but a kind of confident geometric precision that spoke of a civilization that had solved different problems than his own. And sitting cross-legged in a chair pulled close to his bed, asleep with her chin on her chest, was a girl with red, tipped black hair and a red cloak draped over a combat uniform, holding a massive folded weapon across her lap that she hadn't let go of even in sleep. She was also, he estimated, about 15 years old. Maybe 14. Definitely younger than him. He was still trying to figure out how to announce that he was awake without startling her into swinging the weapon when she snapped upright, silver eyes wide, looked directly at him and said something fast in a language he didn't understand. He held up both hands, palms out. Universal. She stopped. Stared. Her eyes dropped to his hands, then came back up to his face, taking in the whisker marks the way everyone always did, the 3 beat pause, the reassessment. He said, in his own language, "I'm not going to hurt you." Then felt immediately foolish because she obviously couldn't understand him, but she relaxed slightly anyway. Tone carried. That was universal too. She pointed at herself and said something, a word, a short one, said with the particular emphasis of an introduction. A name, he pointed back. Naruto. She repeated it, careful with the sounds. Na-ru-to, close enough. He nodded. She pointed at herself again. RWBY. He had the language in 11 days. Not perfectly, the grammar was alien, the vocabulary enormous, the phonemes requiring adjustments his mouth wasn't accustomed to. But Naruto had spent years communicating with a vastly different kind of consciousness inside his own head, which had given him an unusual aptitude for working out the architecture of communication from context. He was also running 15 shadow clones in dedicated language immersion sessions around the clock, cycling the accumulated experience back into his base consciousness through the clone's dispersal. By day 3, he could handle basic transactions. By day 7, he was arguing with the medical staff about whether he actually needed to stay in the medical wing. By day 11, he was functional enough for Ozpin to decide the formal conversation could no longer be delayed. The headmaster's office occupied the top floor of Beacon's central tower and was, in Naruto's assessment, the office of a man who had lived long enough to accumulate a lot of things and wise enough to put most of them out of arm's reach. Gears turned slowly overhead. Coffee mugs proliferated. The man behind the desk looked 60 and carried himself like someone who'd forgotten more about the world than most people ever learned. Naruto sat across from him, RWBY to his left because she'd appointed herself his unofficial guide, and no one had successfully argued her out of it and told the truth. He told it the way he'd learned to tell hard things, directly, without softening, because softening them usually just extended the discomfort. His world, the shinobi system, The hidden villages, the tailed beasts, the long, miserable logic of a world that had organized its entire power structure around the weaponization of living creatures. The Fourth Shinobi War. What Kaguya had been, what the 10 Tails had been, what it had taken to end it, the rift, Kurama. Ozpin listened to all of it without expression, which Naruto had come to recognize in the past 11 days as his default mode of absorbing significant information. Glinda Goodwitch, standing behind the headmaster with her arms folded, was less composed. Her expression cycled through skepticism, concern, and something approaching vertigo at several points. When he finished, Ozpin was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The seal on your stomach." "It's what's left of the containment array," Naruto said. "My clan, the Uzumaki, they were seal masters, the best in the world. My father used their techniques to bind a 9-tailed fox spirit to me when I was born." He paused. "The fox and I eventually came to an understanding. When the rift opened, he used what was left of his individual existence as a bridge to get me through. He's not gone, he's just part of me now, in a way he wasn't before." "Can it be removed? The seal, you could try." Naruto's voice was pleasant and completely serious. "I wouldn't recommend it." Ozpin studied him across the desk. "You said your world has a tradition of what you called sensor types, people who can detect the life force of others at range." "Yeah. Are you one? I can be. It takes concentration. Sage mode, gathering natural energy from the environment, extends my range and sensitivity significantly." He had not yet tried to gather Remnant's natural energy. He was, frankly, nervous to. The ambient quality of it that brushed against his senses was strange in ways he hadn't fully processed. And without this sage mode, close range, tens of meters maybe, he paused. "Your Grim have no life energy. I noticed that the moment I woke up, whatever they're made of, it's not the same thing as living matter. They don't register as alive." Something changed very slightly in Ozpin's expression. "No, they don't." He set down his coffee cup. "Tell me in your assessment, how dangerous are you, honestly?" Naruto thought about it. He didn't deflect, didn't perform modesty. He'd been in enough real fights to have a calibrated sense of his own capabilities, and false modesty was something he'd never seen the point of. "In my world, I'm one of the strongest people alive. Probably the strongest, though there are a few who come close." He saw Glinda's eyebrows rise. "Here?" "I don't know yet. I'm still figuring out how your world works. The energy system is different. I can't gauge it properly yet." "And your intentions?" "To not cause trouble." He met the headmaster's gaze steadily. "To figure out if there's a way home, and if there isn't—" He stopped, something tightening briefly in his chest. "To figure out what being here means. I'm not an enemy. I've spent my whole life fighting people who were, and I can tell the difference." Ozpin held his gaze for a long, measuring moment. Then he did something that surprised Naruto. He smiled. Small, tired, the smile of a man who'd been carrying weight too long, but genuine. "I believe you," he said. "Which is either my best quality or my most persistent flaw. I've never entirely decided." He folded his hands on the desk. "I am going to offer you a provisional placement at this academy. Not as a student. Your capabilities are clearly beyond the curriculum. As a consultant and field observer, you will accompany students on lower-risk missions. You will share what you're willing to share about your own abilities and knowledge, and in return we will do our best to assist you in understanding Remnant and, if possible, in finding a path home. And if I find trouble before I'm ready for it, then you will handle it," Ozpin said simply, "as you apparently have always handled trouble." He stood, extending his hand in the gesture Naruto had picked up as Remnant's equivalent of a formal agreement. "Welcome to Beacon, Naruto Uzumaki. Try not to destroy anything load-bearing." Naruto shook the hand. "No promises." From his left, Ruby made a small, excited sound that she immediately suppressed when Glinda looked at her. The next 2 weeks were a study in controlled chaos. Beacon students were, as a population, deeply curious and deeply bad at hiding it. Word had spread about the mystery boy in the medical wing before Naruto had even been formally cleared to move around campus. And by the time he was, with an ID badge that Glinda had produced with the tight expression of someone making the best of an imperfect situation. He could feel the attention following him through the corridors like a physical thing. He was used to it. He'd spent his childhood being stared at for worse reasons. Ruby attached herself to his side with the cheerful single-mindedness of a puppy who had decided you were interesting and intended to get to the bottom of you. She introduced him to her team with the air of someone presenting a very exciting new discovery. Team RWBY occupied a dormitory room that smelled of weapon oil and someone's excessively floral shampoo, and the four of them looked at him with four very distinct expressions when Ruby opened the door and said, with absolutely no preamble, "This is Naruto. He's from another dimension and he has a giant fox spirit inside him and he speaks Japanese and I've been teaching him English." The girl with white hair and blue eyes looked at Ruby, then at Naruto, then back at Ruby. "You've been visiting the quarantine ward." "Technically," Ruby said. "Technically," the white-haired girl repeated, in a tone that had entire chapters of frustration compressed into a single word. Then she looked at Naruto with the particular expression of someone performing a rapid and not entirely favorable assessment. "Weiss Schnee. And before you ask, yes, of the Schnee Dust Company, and no, I don't owe you anything simply because of that." "I wasn't going to ask," Naruto said. That seemed to slightly rearrange her assessment. The girl with black hair and a bow on her head was sitting cross-legged on her bed with a book open in her lap, and looked up with the careful attention of someone who read people the way she read text, methodically, catching everything. "Blake," she said, just the one word. Then she went back to her book, which was, Naruto recognized now, not dismissal. It was how she processed things. She'd be thinking about him for hours. The last one, tall, strong-looking, blonde hair pulled back, lilac eyes with the specific alertness of someone who enjoyed a challenge, dropped off her bunk and walked over with the directness of someone who decided the fastest route to an answer was to get in arm's reach of the question. "Yang Xiao Long," she said, and extended her hand. Naruto shook it. Her grip was firm. His was too. Her eyes registered that with the faintest flicker of reassessment. "Ruby says you've got crazy powers," Yang said. "Ruby talks a lot," Naruto observed. "She really does." Yang grinned. "So how crazy?" Naruto considered her. There was something uncomplicated and immediate about Yang Xiao Long that he found, after 11 days of careful navigation and formal conversations, genuinely refreshing. "Crazy enough," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the answer I have until I know more about your scale." Yang looked at him for another moment, then laughed full and easy, the laugh of someone who didn't perform it. "Okay," she said. "Fair." She dropped back onto a bunk. "You can stay." "I wasn't aware that was up for debate," Weiss said. "It was a little up for debate," Yang said. "It absolutely." "It was up for debate," Blake said, without looking up from her book. Ruby beamed at Naruto as if this had gone exactly as well as she'd hoped. Which, by her expression, it had. He found the roof by accident, 3 nights into his campus residency, following the particular quality of the night air upward through a maintenance stairwell, emerging onto a flat section of Beacon's upper architecture where the view opened in every direction, and veils spread below in a glittering sprawl that was genuinely beautiful in a way that hit him somewhere unguarded. He sat on the ledge and looked at it and didn't think about home. He was very deliberately not thinking about home. He was not particularly succeeding. "You're going to fall," Blake's voice said, behind him. He didn't startle. He'd felt her footsteps on the stairwell, that careful, quiet tread, but he turned to look at her. She had a book under one arm and was watching him with the same methodical attention as before. She'd come up here for the same reason he had, he guessed. People who needed quiet sought the same geography. "I won't fall," he said. "You've been sitting on a ledge 12 floors up for an hour." "I have excellent balance." She made a sound that might have been the beginning of amusement. She sat down on the roof proper, back against the low wall, and opened her book, but didn't read it yet. A comfortable silence developed that was, he realized, specifically comfortable because she wasn't trying to fill it, After a while, she said, "Ruby told us about what you said, about the fox." "Kurama, Kurama," she paused. "She said you described it like losing someone." "Yeah." "Is that what it feels like?" He thought about it honestly. "It's like losing someone who was part of you for so long that you don't fully know where you end and where they began. And now you do know because they're gone and the knowing is." He stopped. "Yeah, it feels like losing someone." Blake was quiet. Then, "I know about carrying something that defines you, something that other people see first before they see you." Her voice was even but careful. "I know about what it feels like when that thing is gone or changed, whether you lose it or leave it." He looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Vale. "It doesn't stop feeling like loss," she said, "but it stops feeling only like loss, eventually." He turned back to the city, too. "Eventually," he said. They sat there for another hour. She read her book. He watched the lights of Vale and let himself, very carefully, feel what he needed to feel without letting it swallow him whole. When he climbed down to go to sleep, she said, without looking up, "I come up here most nights if you need company that doesn't require conversation." "Good to know," he said. The stairwell door closed behind him. He walked back to the temporary quarters Glinda had assigned him, a small room off the staff corridor, sparse and white like the medical wing but his, and he lay down on the soft mattress and stared at the ceiling and thought, "Okay, so this is where you are. Figure out what that means." He was asleep in 4 minutes. Old soldier's habit in the warm dark of his chakra network, deep and banked and very quiet, something that had been Kurama pulsed once, slow and steady as a heartbeat, present as gravity. He slept without nightmares for the first time in weeks. In his office, Ozpin set down the report from Vale's early warning division. The grim activity in the eastern forest had dropped 40% since the night of the impact. Predators that had been ranging toward Vale's outskirts for weeks had reversed course without explanation. He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold again. He thought about a seal that pulsed like a second heartbeat. About a boy who told the truth the way people only did when they'd learned that lying made things worse. About the quality of the energy field that surrounded him, old, layered, nothing like any semblance or dust, expression in Remnant's recorded history. Whatever Naruto Uzumaki was, he was not an enemy. He was also not going to be easy. Ozpin found, on balance, that he was all right with that. Easy rarely changed anything. He walked to his window and looked out at Beacon's grounds. In the distance, barely visible in the dark, 2 figures sat on an upper rooftop, one reading, one watching the city, in the particular silence of people who had found, without negotiating it, a comfortable way to exist in proximity. He watched them for a moment. "Interesting," he said, to no one in particular, and finished his coffee. Chapter 2, What is a shinobi to a hunter? The mission briefing was straightforward enough that Yang called it a warm-up. Escort a dust shipment from a mid-range depot on Vale's Eastern Trade Road to a refinery station 12 kilometers inside the city's supply corridor. Standard protective detail, the kind of mission that first-year teams drew regularly, designed to build operational habits without exposing students to threats above their current ceiling. 1 bullhead for transport, 4 huntresses in training, and a cargo container of refined fire dust worth enough to make theft plausible, but not enough to attract serious organizational attention. Professor Goodwich had added 1 modification to the standard parameters. "Naruto will accompany the team as a non-combat observer," she'd said, in the tone she used when the decision had already been made, and the explanation was a courtesy rather than an invitation to discussion. "His role is observational only. He is not to engage hostiles. He is not to use whatever abilities he possesses without direct authorization, and he is under no circumstances to." "I know," Naruto had said. "I hadn't finished. You were going to say something about not doing anything that would require you to file additional paperwork." The silence that followed was technically proof of nothing. Glinda Goodwich's expression was technically neutral. Technically, Ruby had made a sound into her sleeve. The bullhead set down 2 kilometers from the depot at the designated landing zone, a flat clearing off the trade road where the tree line was thin enough to provide sightlines in 3 directions. The morning was cool and overcast, the kind of gray veil weather that Naruto had come to associate with the season, and the forest to the east had the particular stillness that he'd learned over the past 2 weeks of campus living to pay attention to. He stood at the tree line while Team RWBY ran their pre-mission checks and let his senses extend outward. No active chakra, Remnant's population didn't produce chakra, so there was nothing to read there. But the basic sensitivity he maintained without effort, the low-grade awareness that was as natural to him as breathing, caught something else. Disrupted foliage, 60 meters in. Dispersed body heat in a pattern inconsistent with wildlife. The specific quality of stillness that people produced when they were actively trying to be quiet. 12. Maybe 14. Waiting, he turned and looked at Team RWBY. They were doing their checks with professional efficiency. Weiss cycling through her glyph calibrations with precise hand movements. Yang rolling her gauntlets through a function test that produced 4 quick bursts of smoke. Blake checking her ammunition ribbons with practiced speed. RWBY running a final inspection of Crescent Rose's transformation mechanism. They were good. He'd been watching them on campus for 2 weeks, in the training halls and the corridors, and the way they moved through space, and they were genuinely good. Different levels of polish, RWBY's instincts were extraordinary. Yang's power and aggression were refined without being controlled. Blake's speed and technique were precise in ways that spoke of training that had started very young, but all of them better than the average Beacon student by a visible margin. They were also walking toward an ambush that their standard pre-mission equipment checks weren't designed to detect. He fell into step beside RWBY, who was heading for the tree line. "Hey! Hey!" she said, with the reliable enthusiasm she brought to every interaction, including ones that began at 6 in the morning. "Ready for your first real mission? I know it's technically observer status, but it's still exciting, right? Have you done escort missions before? In your world? Thousands." He said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Do huntsmen typically move straight into an ambush site, or is that a Vale-specific thing?" RWBY stopped walking. Yang, 3 steps ahead, stopped too. The question moved through the team like a current, not alarm, but the specific sharpening of attention that combat, trained people produced when someone said the word ambush with that particular quality of certainty. Weiss turned. "Explain!" 60 meters, roughly northeast. 14 people, maybe a few more if they're stacked tighter than their heat signature suggests. He kept his voice level. "They've been there for at least 2 hours. The forest floor compression pattern says they came in from the east, which means they knew this landing zone before we announced the route." He paused. "Which means either they have a source inside Vale's dispatch system, or this route was predictable enough that they staked multiple positions. Either way, not random. 4 huntresses in training looked at him with 4 slightly different versions of the same expression. "How are you doing that?" Weiss asked. "Sensing. It's a technique. Takes concentration to extend far, but baseline awareness is more or less constant." He shrugged. "Where I'm from, you learn it or you get surprised. Being surprised is usually more expensive." "White Fang," Blake said quietly, not a question exactly, more like a thing she was testing the shape of. "I don't know what White Fang is." "You will," Yang said, and there was something underneath the easy delivery of it that wasn't quite bitterness and wasn't quite grief. "Okay, 14 targets northeast, 60 meters. Crescent Rose, you want to call it." RWBY had shifted. The bright chatness was still there somewhere, but it had been folded away into a back pocket, replaced by something older and sharper. The change was immediate and complete and impressive. "We don't engage inside the tree line, no clean sight lines, and they'll know the terrain. We need to draw them out." She looked at Naruto. "Can you tell if they're armed, weapons, dust, based from the crystalline resonance, probably rifles?" "White Fang loadout," Blake said. Her voice was very even. "Okay," RWBY's silver eyes moved across the clearing, calculating. Yang, you and I circle left, wide, stay on the roadside. Weiss, you take the right and give us glyph coverage. Blake, you're with Naruto? A pause. Naruto, observer status means you hang back. If something goes wrong, observer status? He agreed, in a tone that answered her question and raised a secondary one she didn't pursue. She looked at him for one more second. Then, let's go. He stayed back. He was very good at staying back. Staying back was a thing he had done precisely once in his adult life, on a mission outside the Land of Fire on a night when Kakashi. Sensei had explicitly ordered it, and the result had been 2 broken ribs and a concussion from a poorly timed explosive tag. After that, he'd made peace with the fact that staying back was a theoretical concept he understood academically but couldn't implement biochemically. He stood at the tree line and watched. They were good. He'd thought so before. He was more sure of it now. RWBY moved through the forest at a speed that produced rose petals and left afterimages. Genuinely extraordinary, the kind of movement speed that put her in a category above most combatants he'd encountered in pure relocation terms. Yang was a different kind of fast, the point explosiveness of someone who'd optimized for closing distance and delivering force rather than coverage. Blake was almost silent, shadow, jumping between positions with a clone decoy technique that his shadow clone, attuned senses found professionally interesting. Weiss laid a glyph network across the approach vectors with the systematic precision of an engineer, each one perfectly placed. 14 White Fang operatives emerged from the tree line when the team drew them out, masks, weapons, the controlled movement of people who'd done this before. They opened fire immediately, professional and organized, no warning. The opening volley was well coordinated. Team RWBY handled it. Not perfectly, RWBY took a grazing hit that her aura absorbed without trouble, and Weiss burned through her glyph reserves faster than was ideal, but handled it. They moved in the specific synergy of people who'd trained together, covering each other's angles without explicit communication, responding to each other's movements with the intuitive geometry of a team that trusted one another. He watched. He kept his arms folded. He tracked every combatant's position automatically, the way he tracked weather, because the habit was structural. They were handling 14. Then the second wave came from the south, 8 more. Moving fast, organized, and his senses caught it half a second before the team's line of sight did. These ones had explosives. Short-range dust, pack charges designed to force movement into a kill zone. The first 2 went off before Blake could redirect, concussive enough to break formation, scattering the team into separate defensive positions and cutting their mutual coverage. Yang took 2 rifle shots to the back. Her aura held, but she staggered. Weiss went down on one knee from a charge that detonated at her feet. A thin crack running through her aura field that was visible, just barely, in the specific quality of the light around her. RWBY was moving to compensate, which left Blake isolated on the south side with 4 incoming targets and an angle that put the tree line behind her. Naruto unfolded his arms. He didn't use chakra. There was no visible effect, no glow, no technique, no flare of orange that would have drawn attention. He simply moved, and the way he moved was the product of approximately 10,000 hours of specialized conditioning that had begun when he was 12 years old and never really stopped. He came out of the tree line at a dead sprint, hit the first operative from the south wave before the man had registered his existence, and redirected him into his neighbor with a precisely placed hip throw that used both their momentum and the operational principle that the most efficient way to remove 2 problems was to make them each other's problem. He was already gone by the time both of them hit the ground. The next 3 happened in a second and a half. He didn't hit hard enough to cause serious injury. He hit precisely enough to cause maximum incapacitation. Joint locks applied to full extension in fractions of a second, pressure point strikes that shut down limb function temporarily, one choke that put a particularly large operative unconscious with surgical efficiency. He moved between them the way water moved around rocks, and the whole thing had the quality of watching someone do something that looked simple, because the person doing it had removed every unnecessary element. Blake stared at him from 3 meters away. He straightened up, dusted off his hands, looked at the 4 incapacitated figures around him, and then looked at her. "Observer status," he said. She stared at him for another moment. Then, very deliberately, she turned and engaged the remaining operative from her own angle, because she was a professional and the fight wasn't over. It was over 30 seconds later. The aftermath had the particular texture of post-combat adrenaline, people checking themselves and each other, assessing damage, coming down from the sharpened edge of it. Yang was running a self-diagnostic on her gauntlets. RWBY was crouched over an incapacitated White Fang operative, frowning at the mask. Blake was standing apart, looking at the masks too with an expression that had closed down into something private. Weiss walked up to Naruto. "Observer status," she said. "Technically, I didn't use any techniques." He said, "That was entirely physical. You put 4 armed operatives on the ground in under 2 seconds. It was closer to 1.5. Her ice blue eyes were doing the rapid assessment thing they did when she was recalibrating her model of something. He'd seen it when he'd first met her. She didn't like being surprised, not from hostility, but from the specific discomfort of someone who organized their world through precise understanding and found gaps irritating. "Where did you learn to fight like that, my world?" He paused. "Every child in the hidden villages starts combat training at age 6. Specialized physical conditioning at 8, first real missions at 12. He watched her expression shift. "I know it's not the same system you have here." "That's," she searched for the word. "Yeah," he said. He'd had this reaction before, from people who encountered the shinobi system from outside it. "It is." She was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precision of someone choosing their next words carefully, "You saw the second wave before we did." "Yes." "How far out?" "The moment they entered the forest, maybe 800 meters. Another recalibration, smaller this time, like she'd been expecting something significant and was now adjusting the scale upward. "And you waited," she said, "until our formation broke. You were handling it. And when we weren't—" He met her gaze steadily. "Then I stopped watching." Weiss held his gaze for a moment, then she looked away, back at the clearing, at the neatly incapacitated figures that no one else on her team had touched. "I see," she said, which was, Naruto was learning, Weiss Schnee's version of fair enough. She walked away to help RWBY with the post-combat sweep. He watched her go and thought that she would be thinking about this conversation for a while, turning it over in the precise machinery of her mind, filing it somewhere. Good. That was fine. He was thinking about her too. Yang found him during the cargo transfer, when the bullhead was loaded and the captured White Fang operatives had been secured for Vale PD pickup. And the team had spread out in the comfortable dispersal of people waiting for the last administrative element of a mission to conclude. She dropped down next to him where he was sitting on the cargo container's edge and said without preamble, "Spar me." "We're on a mission," he said. "Mission's basically over. Cargo's loaded, prisoners are secured. Weiss is filing the contact report." She stretched her arms above her head, the gesture of someone whose body was still running hot from combat and needed an outlet. "Come on, you took down 4 of theirs without breaking a sweat. I want to see what you actually are." He looked at her. Yang Xiao, long in the post-combat window, was a specific version of herself, more direct than usual. The social ease stripped down to its actual components, which were mostly confidence and appetite for challenge in roughly equal measure. Her lilac eyes had that brightness that he'd noticed during the fight, the particular quality of someone who was most themselves when the stakes were real. "Your semblance," he said. "What does it do?" She held up her gauntlets. "I absorb kinetic energy and convert it to power. Hit me hard enough, I hit back harder," she smiled. "So you might want to be careful. And you absorb it through the gauntlets, specifically through my aura, which the gauntlets channel. Why?" He thought about it for a moment. "Okay," he said, and hopped off the container. Yang's smile widened. He let her open. The first punch was fast. Very fast. faster than most of the taijutsu specialists he'd sparred with in the early part of his career. And he felt the quality of it, the specific type of force that was physical strength amplified by something structural. Something in the way her aura channeled her body's output. He let it connect. It hit him in the forearm where he'd raised a block. The impact was significant, more than he'd expected from someone her size, a compression of force that would have broken the arm of anyone without his conditioning and chakra-reinforced skeletal structure. He didn't move. His feet stayed planted. Yang blinked. He felt the change in her, not just tactically, but in the specific quality of her aura. The absorbed energy was sitting in her system now, cycling toward release. She hit again, 3 rapid combinations, and he blocked each one and stood his ground and felt them hit like a sequence of progressively larger waves. Then he moved. She'd been hitting him in the same structural way each time, direct, linear, optimizing for maximum force delivery on contact. He knew that pattern. He'd fought rank shinobi with similar force multiplier abilities, and the answer was always the same. Don't give them the angle they need for the technique to matter. He slipped inside her follow, threw on the 4th combination, pivoted around her arm rather than against it, and was behind her in a movement that her eyes registered half a second after her body did. He didn't strike. He just stood there. Behind her. One hand raised, indicating the contact point that would have ended the exchange. Yang turned around slowly. They looked at each other. "How?" she said. "Speed," he said. "Not reacting to your attacks, reacting to your preparation for them. There's a difference." She stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, and this wasn't the easy laugh from the dorm room. This was smaller, genuinely surprised, the laugh of someone who hadn't been caught flat-footed in a while and found it refreshing rather than humiliating. "Okay," she said. "Round 2. Round 2 lasted 4 minutes, which was, and he was aware of this, significantly longer than it needed to. He kept letting her land hits because the hits were informative, each one telling him something about the mechanics of her semblance that he filed away carefully. By the end, he had a complete picture of its rhythm and its limits. Maximum absorption threshold, release timing, the specific window after a major output where her aura needed a beat to recalibrate. The round ended with him holding her wrist at full arm extension, her in mid-punch, both of them breathing, her more than him. "You were figuring out how I work," she said. "Yes. The whole time." "Yes." She pulled her wrist back. The expression on her face was complex, competitive frustration and something that wasn't quite it but lived in the same neighborhood. "That's annoying," she said. "It's how I was trained," he said. "Every opponent is a problem, every problem has a solution. You read the data first." "And what's the solution for me?" He thought about telling her the tactical answer, the specific window, the absorption threshold, the reset timing. Then he looked at her expression and decided on honesty instead. "I don't know yet," he said. "You're more interesting than most problems I've read." Yang looked at him. Something shifted in that, not immediately visible, but there, in the small recalibration of how she was looking at him. Not as a combatant to assess, as a person saying something that was probably meant as a compliment from someone who mostly spoke in tactical language. "HM," she said, which was not a rejection of the information. He filed that too. The bullhead ride back was quiet. Ruby dozed in her seat, the post-combat drop hitting her faster than the others, the cost of running at her speed. Weiss reviewed her own performance report with the methodical self, criticism of someone who treated their own mistakes as data. Yang watched the cloud cover outside the window with the particular thoughtful silence of someone who was having a different conversation internally. Blake sat across from Naruto, book open as always, and after 20 minutes of flight, she said, without looking up, "You knew they had a second wave before you moved." "Yes, you waited until we were in real trouble. You weren't in real trouble until formation broke." 4 of us against 22, she said. "In my experience, most people don't wait until the last comfortable moment. They act on the first available window." "In my experience," he said, "acting before your allies need you removes the information you get from watching them work." He paused. And they don't learn anything if someone else solves it for them. Blake looked up from the book. The amber eyes were very direct. You were evaluating us. I was learning about you, he said, which was different, and they both knew it. The same way you've been learning about me since I showed up. A beat. Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. She looked back at her book. The White Fang, she said after a moment. They're a faunus rights organization that went militant approximately 6 years ago. They're Vale's most active anti-human paramilitary group. A pause. I used to be a member. He didn't say anything. He let it sit, which was how he'd learned she preferred to handle things she'd decided to tell him. I left, she said, when they stopped being about rights and started being about something else. Her finger traced a line on the page she wasn't reading. The masks they wear, they chose those. The animal masks, they wear them as a statement. What kind of statement? That they're exactly what humans already think they are. Her voice was very even. That's the part I couldn't stay for. He looked at her for a long moment. Thanks for telling me, he said. Simply, without making more of it than it was, she turned a page. You should know what you're going to be dealing with, she said. Since you're apparently dealing with things now, observer status notwithstanding. He smiled at that, small and genuine. Observer status, he said. She said, in the tone of someone who found the ongoing fiction approximately as convincing as he did. Debrief was in Goodwich's office, which had the specific energy of a room that had witnessed many post-mission conversations, and intended to witness many more without surprise. She listened to RWBY's verbal report with a stylus in hand, making notes that only she could interpret, and then turned to the tactical summary Weiss had filed. 22 confirmed hostiles, she said. 14 initial, 8 secondary, dust, pack explosives in the second wave. Someone knew your route. Naruto flagged it, RWBY said. Before we'd gone 20 meters, he sensed them. Glinda's stylus paused. She looked at him. At what range? 60 meters when I first registered them. I could have caught them earlier, but I wasn't actively scanning, he considered. I can extend that range significantly with specific techniques. I haven't tried it in Remnant's environment yet. Why not? The natural energy here is, he stopped, choosing the word carefully. Complicated, I'm being cautious. Glinda filed that somewhere. Then she looked at the combat summary. 4 White Fang operatives were incapacitated by what PD is describing as advanced hand, 2-hand techniques. These 4 operatives were part of the second wave. A pause. Observer status, Yang said helpfully. Observer status, Naruto agreed. Glinda looked at both of them with the expression of someone who had anticipated this exact conversation and was experiencing the specific exhaustion of being right. Naruto, she said. The team's formation was broken, he said. The second wave had a kill angle on Blake. Yang and Weiss were in a damage deficit. RWBY was compensating. He held Glinda's gaze. I calculated that observer status costs less paperwork than a dead student. The silence that followed was careful. That logic is not without merit. Glinda said finally in a tone that was professionally neutral and personally pained. She made one more note. Next mission, observer status means non-combat unless direct threat to life, yours or theirs. Understood, he said, and you will warn me, she said. If whatever is in that seal of yours decides to do something I need to know about. He thought of the deep, warm quiet of Kurama's banked embers. You'll know, he said. I'll make sure of it. She held his gaze for one more second, professional assessment running full and frank. Then she nodded once, in the manner of someone choosing, deliberately, to accept a situation they couldn't fully control. Dismissed, she said. Late that night, Ozpin received Glinda's mission report and the PD contact summary alongside it, and he sat in his office and read both with the thoroughness that he applied to anything that was going to matter. He read about the second wave. He read the PD's description of the incapacitation technique. He read Naruto's explanation, delivered in the flat, practical language of someone who assessed threats the way accountants assessed numbers. The team's formation was broken. The second wave had a kill angle on Blake. I calculated that observer status costs less paperwork than a dead student. Ozpin set the report down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he picked up his scroll and sent a single-line message to an old colleague in Atlas, an inquiry about a specific kind of sensing technique, one that could detect Grimm beyond standard sighting range, that he'd heard theoretical discussion of but never seen implemented. The reply came back in 12 minutes, theoretically possible but never demonstrated. Requires a sensitivity to life energy that no documented semblance has produced. Why Ozpin considered how to answer. Then he typed, doing some research. He closed the scroll, looked at the report one more time. The White Fang had known the route. Someone in Vale's dispatch system was compromised, or the route had been predictable enough for advanced positioning, and neither option was comfortable. The timing, 2 weeks after an anomalous dimensional arrival, an arrival that had driven off every Grimm within a 12-kilometer radius, was the kind of coincidence he had learned, across a very long life, not to take at face value. He stood at his window. Below, the grounds of Beacon were quiet and dark and ordinary, looking the way a chessboard looked ordinary until you understood what was on it. Somewhere in the East Wing dormitories, a boy with a seal on his stomach and the remnants of a 9-tailed fox dissolved into his chakra network was either asleep or watching the lights of Vale from a rooftop. And Ozpin found that both possibilities seemed equally likely and equally appropriate. He thought about what was coming. The things in motion that most of his students didn't yet know were in motion. He thought about a signal that no Grimm would approach. He thought about what that might be worth in the months ahead. "Interesting," he said, very quietly, to the dark. Then he turned from the window, sat back down at his desk, and began planning for contingencies. Chapter 3. The Sage Wakes in a Wild World. He chose the cliffs, 3 kilometers east of Beacon, past the training grounds and the maintained forest paths and the outer sensor perimeter. The terrain broke into a series of basalt ledges that dropped sharply toward the sea. The cliffs were exposed and windswept and technically outside the standard student patrol route, which meant they were as close to alone as Beacon's geography allowed. The ocean below was gray-green in the early morning light, heavy with the particular weight of deep water, and the wind came off it cold and direct and carrying salt. Naruto stood at the edge of the outermost ledge, bare feet on stone, and looked at the horizon for a long time. He'd been building toward this for 3 weeks. Not avoiding it, he didn't avoid things, hadn't since he was 13, and decided that avoidance was just fear wearing sensible shoes, but approaching it carefully, the way you approached an explosive seal you hadn't written yourself. Reading the environment first. Letting his baseline senses sit with Remnant's natural energy passively without drawing on it, the way you let your eyes adjust to darkness before you tried to see anything specific. And what his baseline senses told him, after 3 weeks of passive contact, was that Remnant's natural energy was ancient and vast and wounded, not corrupt. He wanted to be precise about that because the distinction mattered. In his world, corrupted natural energy was what happened when the balance between life and emptiness broke down. It produced cursed seals. It produced the monstrous transformations he'd seen in people who took power they weren't prepared for. Corruption had a specific quality. It felt like something healthy that had been inverted. This wasn't that. This felt like something that had been hurt. A long time ago, deeply and comprehensively, and had been living with the wound ever since. The natural energy of Remnant still moved. It flowed through the landscape the way it was supposed to, cycling through soil and stone and atmosphere, but underneath that flow, running like a current beneath a current, was something that resonated with the Grimm. Not the same as the Grimm, but related to whatever process had produced them. A scar in the world's energy field, very old and very large. He'd thought about this for 3 weeks. He'd reached one conclusion. The only way to know if he could work with it was to try. He closed his eyes, let his breathing slow. This part was practiced enough to be automatic, the interior settling, the conscious release of directed thought, the specific quality of stillness that sage mode required. Not emptiness. That was the common misunderstanding. Sage mode wasn't about becoming empty. It was about becoming open, wide enough to receive the natural energy around you, permeable to the world rather than separate from it. He opened himself. The natural energy came in immediately, faster than it had in his world. Remnant's reserves were enormous. The kind of environmental saturation he'd only felt at Myabokuzen, the Toad Sage Mountain, where natural energy pooled deep and rich over thousands of years. But the quality was different. In his world, the inflow was balanced, physical energy, spiritual energy, and natural energy combining in a stable triple rhythm. Here, the natural energy carried the undertow. That wounded current, threading through everything, he felt it touch his chakra network, and his network reacted. Not subtly. The way his network reacted to a foreign element that it couldn't categorize was the same way a body reacted to an allergen, immediate, systemic, the cellular equivalent of what is this, and is it trying to kill me? His chakra coils locked down defensively, which disrupted the flow from the seal, which destabilized the Kurama embers banked in his system, which produced a feedback loop that hit him like a physical blow. He staggered, caught himself on one knee, kept the contact. Losing it now would be worse than maintaining it. The way releasing a live wire was more dangerous than holding it if you released at the wrong moment. The wound in Remnant's energy was threading through his network, examining him. And then, and this was the part he hadn't expected, it pushed back, not aggressively, not like an attack, more like a question. Like something very old that had been alone for a very long time encountering something it recognized as alive and being uncertain what to do about it. He felt it probe at the seal. Felt it find the Kurama embers, not the fox's individual consciousness, but the essence of what Kurama had been, the vast antiquity of it, the weight of a creature that had existed since the beginning of the chakra world. The wound in Remnant's energy recoiled. Then it did something he had no framework for. It grieved. He didn't have a better word for it. The quality of what moved through his network in that moment was the specific feeling of recognition followed immediately by loss. The way you felt when you met someone who reminded you of a person you'd loved and couldn't reach anymore. As if whatever had wounded Remnant's natural energy recognized what Kurama's essence was, or at least recognized what it was adjacent to. And the recognition produced something between sorrow and longing. Naruto, on one knee at the edge of a cliff with his chakra network in open revolt and Remnant's wounded soul pressing against him, did the thing that every sensible teacher he'd ever had would have told him not to do. He pressed back. Gently, deliberately. Not drawing the energy in, just letting his own chakra reach outward, the way you extended a hand in darkness to tell something you were there and not threatening. The wound went still, then it withdrew. Slowly, like a tide going out. The pressure on his network released, and he felt his chakra coils unlock one by one, the destabilization resolving, the Kurama embers settling back into their banked warmth. He opened his eyes. Both hands were on the stone. He was breathing hard, harder than any physical exertion in weeks had made him breathe. His chakra network felt like it had been turned inside out and then back again. His fingers were shaking slightly, which he looked at with detached interest because he genuinely couldn't remember the last time his hands had shaken from anything. From behind him, 15 meters back on the safer section of the cliff path, RWBY said, "Naruto?" Her voice was very careful. He turned around slowly. She was standing at the edge of the maintained path with crescent rows folded across her back, and an expression that was trying to be calm and not entirely succeeding. She'd followed him, not sneaking. He'd felt her footsteps on the path before she'd gotten close, but he'd been deep enough in the preparation that he hadn't processed it as something to address. Silver eyes wide, taking in the details, him on one knee, hands on stone, clearly not in great shape. I'm fine, he said. You don't look fine, she said. You look like Yang after she punched a Goliath. I'm better than that. Your hands are shaking. He looked at his hands. They were. I'm working on something, he said. It's in progress. She came forward, carefully, watching the cliff edge with the practical awareness of someone who'd learned to read terrain, and crouched next to him, close enough that her red cloak pooled on the stone between them. She looked at his face with the specific attention she brought to things that concerned her, which was less the attention of someone performing concern and more the attention of someone taking actual inventory. "What were you doing?" she asked. He sat back, shifting from the knee to properly seated on the ledge, and told her. The sage mode, the natural energy, the wound he'd felt in Remnant's energy field and what had happened when he'd touched it. Ruby listened the way she always listened to things that interested her, completely without interrupting, filing every piece. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The wound," she said. "What did it feel like when you said it grieved?" "Like recognition and loss," he said. "Like it knew what I was carrying and couldn't," he stopped. "Like it missed something." Ruby pulled her knees up, arms around them. The wind came off the ocean and moved her hair. "My mom had silver eyes," she said, out of what seemed like nowhere but wasn't. "It's a thing. People with silver eyes can hurt Grimm directly. Like, stop them. I've done it once accidentally. It was terrifying." She looked at the horizon. "Professor Ozpin says the power connected to silver eyes is very old, from before the kingdoms, from when the world was different." A pause. "What if the wound you felt is connected to that? Whatever happened that made the world need people with silver eyes?" He looked at her. Sometimes Ruby Rose said something that sounded like a 15-year-old being optimistic and was actually a 15-year-old being very sharp. "That's a good thought," he said. She brightened slightly. "I have those sometimes. Weiss says I hide them under the enthusiasm." "Weiss isn't wrong," he said. "She really isn't." Ruby picked at the hem of her cloak. "Are you going to try again?" "Not today," he said. "The network needs to stabilize." He looked at his hands, steady now mostly. "But yes, I'm going to try again." "Can I watch? Next time?" He thought about what next time was going to look like. The wound's reaction had been strong but not hostile. He'd learned something from the contact. He could approach differently, not as an outsider trying to take something from Remnant's energy, but as something the energy had already examined and not destroyed. Use that recognition. "Next time," he said. "Stand a bit farther back." Ruby's smile was small and warm, and, in the gray morning light with the ocean below and the cliff stone cold under both of them, unexpectedly grounding. "Deal," she said. They sat there for a while. Neither of them needed to be anywhere for another hour. The wind kept coming off the ocean, and the horizon stayed gray, and the company was, he thought, exactly the kind he hadn't known he needed. 3 days later, the mission file landed on Ozpin's desk. A White Fang cell operating out of an industrial district on Vale's eastern edge had been tracked to a specific warehouse through a combination of Huntsman intelligence, and an Atlas tip that Ironwood had passed along with the studied casualness of someone doing a favor he intended to remember. The cell was mid-tier, not leadership, but above basic foot soldiers. Intelligence suggested they were coordinating dust shipment interceptions across Vale's supply corridor. "Team RWBY," Ozpin said, "with appropriate support." "They're first-year students," Glinda said. "They're first-year students who handled a 22-person ambush 2 weeks ago with 2 of them compromised before the engagement ended," Ozpin said. "And they have." "Don't," Glinda said. "A consultant," he finished. Glinda made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a word. The industrial district at 2 in the morning had the specific quality of urban spaces not built for human comfort, harsh angles, functional lighting designed for visibility rather than warmth. The smell of dust refining operations that hung in the air like a chemical signature. Naruto moved along the roofline of a processing facility 300 meters from the target warehouse and let his senses extend. Blake moved parallel to him, 6 meters to the right, with the preternatural quiet of someone for whom silence wasn't an effort but a default state. Below and ahead, Ruby and Yang were on the ground approach, using the cover of the facility row. 30 inside, he said quietly. Main floor, second floor, 12 on the second. That's probably where the coordination is happening. 18 on the main floor with what I'm reading as significant dust storage. A pause. And something else. Blake stopped moving. What kind of something else? He tried to put a precise description to what he was sensing from the far end of the warehouse and couldn't find one that was fully accurate. Someone with a different kind of energy signature, he said. Not aura, not quite, layered on top of it. Like, he searched for the analogy, like a sage mark on a chakra user, something additional that shouldn't be there. Enhanced white fang, Blake said, enhanced something. She relayed it to Ruby over the comm. The response was 3 seconds of silence and then Yang's voice, cheerful and combat, ready, cool. More interesting that way. The breach went clean for the first 40 seconds. Naruto and Blake came through the roof access, Ruby and Yang through the main doors simultaneously. The timing precise enough that the main floor White Fang had no window to organize before the engagement was already inside their defensive perimeter. It was, objectively, a well-executed entry. Then the woman on the second floor walked to the railing and looked down at them, and everything recalibrated. She was tall, with the kind of composed stillness that Naruto associated in his own world with people who'd been in enough serious fights to stop telegraphing anything before it happened. Dark-eyed, pale, complexioned, wearing a long coat with something moving underneath its collar that resolved, on closer inspection, into tendrils of what looked like living shadow, or something adjacent to shadow, darker than the ambient darkness, with a quality that made his senses recoil slightly the way they'd recoiled from the wound in Remnant's natural energy. Not the same, but related. She looked at Team RWBY with the assessment of someone encountering a minor inconvenience. Then her gaze moved to Naruto, and something changed in her expression, not fear, not surprise. Curiosity. The particular curiosity of someone who had expected one thing and found another. Interesting, she said, and her voice carried a quality like silk drawn over something sharp. You're not from here. Neither are you, Naruto said, which was a guess based on what his senses were telling him about the energy she was carrying. Remnant-born people felt a certain way. She didn't feel that way. She felt like something that had been in Remnant a long time but had originated somewhere stranger. What are you? Something your world hasn't produced, she said. The shadow, tendrils at her collar, stirred. She told me there might be something anomalous in Vale. I thought it would be more dramatic. Sorry to disappoint. The corners of her mouth moved. Don't be. Anomalies are her specialty. You'll understand eventually. Her hand came up and she snapped her fingers, and the 18 White Fang on the main floor moved at once, not the organized tactical response of trained fighters, but something more synchronized than that. Too synchronized, like marionettes and a single hand. Kill the students, she said. Leave him. Blake's hand closed on Naruto's arm. Those people aren't moving normally, she said quickly under her breath. The White Fang operatives, they're being controlled. She's doing it. Yeah, he said. He'd felt the energy transfer the moment she'd snapped her fingers, threads of that shadow, adjacent power running from her to each operative, a puppeting technique more efficient and more horrifying than anything he'd seen since the Paths of Pain. Get the team clear of the main floor. I'll handle her. Naruto, Blake, he met her eyes. Get them clear. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she moved because she trusted the confidence in his voice and because she was a professional and he was already gone before she'd taken her third step. He crossed the warehouse floor at a speed that produced no visual warning, no flash, no afterimage, nothing as dramatic as Ruby's rose. Petal burst but functionally invisible to the White Fang operative's reaction time. He hit the second floor railing with one hand and vaulted it cleanly, landing 3 meters from the woman in the long coat. She looked at him with the same composed curiosity. Semblance, she asked. No, he said. Then what? Something your world hasn't produced. He said, which felt like fair game given what she'd said. Who sent you here? Who's her? You'll find out. She tilted her head. You feel the wound, don't you? In the world's energy, I can see it in how you hold yourself, like someone who's touched something they didn't expect. The shadow, tendrils spread, slower now, probing the space between them with an almost sensory quality. She finds that interesting, that something from outside could feel what this world carries. A pause. She wanted me to assess you before any decisions are made. Decisions about what? About whether you're an opportunity or a complication. Below them, the sound of Team RWBY engaging the controlled White Fang operatives filled the warehouse. Ruby's scythe, Yong's gauntlets, Blake's blades, Weiss's glyphs cycling through rapid combinations. They were good and they knew it, and the fight was controlled but not clean, because the operatives weren't fighting like people making tactical decisions. They were fighting like people who'd had their decision-making replaced. The people she's controlling, Naruto said. Can she undo that? When she's incapacitated, the woman said. Or dead. Incapacitated, then. He settled his weight. Fair warning, I'm not trying to kill you. For the first time, something entered her expression that wasn't purely composed. Not fear, he didn't think this woman had a standard fear response. But reassessment. Most people at this point, she said, try to look threatening. I am threatening, he said. I'm just not being rude about it. The shadow tendrils struck. They moved fast, not as fast as he was, but faster than they looked, and they didn't behave like physical attacks. They bent around obstacles, changed direction mid-extension, sought gaps rather than targeting directly. He moved laterally, felt one graze his shoulder, and registered with interest that it tried to take hold, not piercing, but binding, attempting to thread that puppet, control through contact. He pushed chakra through the contact point instinctively, the way he'd learned to clear foreign chakra from his network years ago. The tendril recoiled. The woman's eyes widened, very slightly, but it was the most genuine reaction she'd produced. Interesting, she said again, and this time it was less a performance and more an actual response. Your puppet technique works through energy contact, he said, staying mobile, reading her range and the shadow, tendril's extension limits. Like a specific frequency that overrides the target's own energy. So something that produces a different frequency. He let a thin layer of chakra coat his hands, the barest minimum, not combat output but interference, disrupts the contact. She tilted her head. Behind the composed assessment, something sharpened. You understand technique, she said. It's what I do. He moved. Not at full speed, he was still reading her, still building the picture. She was faster than she looked, the shadow, tendrils doubling as both attack and defense, and whatever she was drawing that power from wasn't aura. It was deep and reserves, heavy and had the quality of something she'd been carrying for a long time. But it wasn't limitless. He could feel the draw on it each time she extended significantly. He let her extend 3 more times, pushing her range, making her work, watching the reserves fluctuate. On the 4th extension, he let the tendril make contact with his forearm, absorbed the attempt to control for exactly 2 seconds while pushing chakra interference through the contact, and felt the moment her concentration broke to address the failed control. In that window, he closed distance. Not striking, not hard. The same joint, control taijutsu from the escort mission, applied to a more sophisticated target. A wrist lock that leveraged the angle of her extended arm. A controlled takedown that put her on the floor with her arm in a position that made getting up without releasing her other techniques structurally inadvisable. He held the position. Incapacitated, he said. Below them, the synchronized movement of the White Fang operatives stuttered and broke. Naruto felt the puppet threads release, each one snapping back like a cut string, the operatives staggering as their own volition returned. The fighting sounds changed. The woman on the floor looked up at him. The composure was still there, which was honestly impressive given the position, and the curiosity hadn't left her eyes. She was right, she said. You are interesting. What's her name? He said. The one who sent you. A long pause. Then, you'll learn it when she decides it's time. The shadow, tendrils had gone still, coiled close, no longer extended. She doesn't move before she's ready, neither do I. A pause. Let me up. No, I won't fight, she said. I've completed my assessment. The fight was the assessment. She met his gaze steadily. And I have a message to deliver. He held the position for another moment, reading her with every sense he had, searching for deception, for a secondary technique, preparing for any signal that the offer was strategic cover. He found nothing, which was either honesty or a level of concealment beyond his ability to detect, and he'd spent a long time learning to tell the difference between those two. He let her up. She rose with the unhurried grace of someone for whom the ground had been an administrative state rather than a defeat. She straightened her coat. The shadow tendrils settled back to their resting pattern at her collar. The message, she said, is this. She knows you're here. She knows what you carry. She knows the wound in this world's energy responded to you in a way it hasn't responded to anything in a very long time. A pause. She says, choose your village carefully. The one you build here will cost you more than the one you left. Then she walked to the window, a real window, looking out over the industrial district, and the shadows pooled around her in a way that had nothing to do with how light worked, and she was gone. Naruto stood in the empty second floor for 3 seconds. Then he turned and looked over the railing. Below, Team RWBY was standing in the aftermath of the engagement, White Fang operatives who'd been controlled now sitting dazed or unconscious on the warehouse floor, the team moving through post-combat checks. RWBY looked up and found him, and her expression asked the question her voice didn't. He shook his head slightly. Later, she nodded. Outside, on the way back to the bullhead, Blake fell into step beside him and matched his pace and said nothing for 3 blocks. This was, he'd learned, how she handled things she was processing but hadn't finished processing. He walked alongside her and let the processing happen, finally. You knew the message before she finished giving it. Not the words, he said. The shape of it. Someone who knows more than they're showing, watching from a distance, not ready to act yet. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. I've dealt with that before. It usually means something's being set up for later. The White Fang cell, Blake said slowly. They were being used. She put them there for you to find so she could assess you. Yeah, which means someone has been watching Vale's Huntsman intelligence channels. Which means someone with access to, she stopped. Resources, he said. Organization, patience, he paused. She mentioned a she, someone the Vanguard answers to. Blake's amber eyes were very controlled. I've heard of someone, she said carefully, through old channels. From when I was still, through old channels. A figure that the White Fang's radical wing spoke about in the way people speak about things they're afraid of and also hoping for. She stopped on the pavement. A woman who can't be killed, who's been working against the kingdoms for longer than the kingdoms have existed. He stopped too and turned to look at her. That's a long time, he said. Yes, she said, it is. In his world, he'd faced Kaguya, a being older than civilization, who'd treated the human world as a garden she'd been temporarily separated from. He knew what ancient malice looked like when it had patience and resources, and a plan that had been running longer than most people's concept of history. Tell me everything you know, he said. All of it. Blake looked at him. The amber eyes held something complicated, the weight of information kept close, old affiliations and their consequences, the specific calculation of a person deciding how much to trust and in what direction. Then she said, Come to the roof tonight. He told Ozpin the next morning. All of it, the Vanguard woman, the puppet technique, the message, and what Blake had shared on the rooftop in the dark. The figure called Salem, older than the kingdoms, who had turned the White Fang's radical wing toward her own purposes without them knowing, who was experimenting with grafting grim, adjacent power to living people, who had been dismantling Remnant's institutional defenses for decades. Ozpin listened to all of it. His expression did not change. When Naruto finished, the headmaster was quiet for a long moment. You already knew. Naruto said, It wasn't an accusation. It was the flat assessment of someone who'd watched a man receive information he wasn't surprised by. I knew some of it, Ozpin said. Some I suspected, some. He paused, and something moved in his expression that was old in a way the expression of a 60-year-old man shouldn't be. Some I'm afraid of confirming, because confirming it makes it real in ways that have consequences I am not yet prepared to manage. Naruto looked at him. That's honest. I try to be. Ozpin folded his hands. She sent her vanguard to assess you? Yes. That means she considers you a variable worth measuring? Yes. And her message? Ozpin's eyes were very careful. The thing about the wound in this world's energy responding to you. She is correct about that? Yeah, he thought about the cliffs, the grief that had moved through Remnant's natural energy when it touched the Kurama essence. Something in the world's energy recognized something in me. I don't know what it means yet. Ozpin was quiet for a long time. Then, I think, he said slowly, that I need to tell you some things about this world's history that I haven't told anyone who didn't already know them. He picked up his coffee. It's a long story. I have time, Naruto said. I'm not going anywhere. Ozpin looked at him. No, he said, in a tone that had layers in it. I don't believe you are. He set the coffee down and began to talk. 2,000 kilometers away, in a place that Remnant's maps didn't accurately describe, because the people who'd made the maps had never returned from it. A woman sat in a high stone chair above a window that looked out on a landscape permanently altered by her presence. And read the report her vanguard had sent. She read it 3 times. Then she set it aside and looked at the view for a long while with the patience of someone for whom a decade was a minor administrative unit. A boy, she said, from somewhere else, carrying something old, something the wound recognized. The grim that attended her, massive, ancient with grim, mask bone covering a skull too large to be anything that had started as natural, shifted slightly at the edge of her vision. The wound, she said, still looking at the view, has been silent for a very long time. A pause. Since before the kingdoms, since before most things, another pause, and now it woke up. She reached out one hand, and the darkness near the window responded. The specific quality of the shadow moving toward her the way shadow didn't, pooling against her palm with the comfortable familiarity of something that had been hers for so long she'd forgotten what the alternative felt like. An opportunity, she said, or a complication? She closed her hand around the darkness. Let's find out which. Chapter 4, Chains and Blossoms. 3 months was not a long time. Naruto knew this in the abstract, intellectual way that people knew things they hadn't fully processed yet. 3 months was a season. In his world, 3 months was the length of a standard long-range mission, the time it took a minor wound to fully heal, the duration between Chunin exams. It was a unit of measurement, not a meaningful span. The universe did not change in 3 months. People did not fundamentally shift in 3 months. And yet, he sat on the roof of Beacon's east wing at 6 in the morning, watching Vale wake up below, and tried to remember what the first morning had felt like, the white ceiling, the alien light, the reaching inward for Kurama and finding only warmth without presence, and found that the memory had the slightly blurred quality of something further away than 3 months should have produced. Remnant had gotten into him. That was the honest assessment. Not slowly and not dramatically, just steadily, the way water found its level, the way a body adapted to altitude. The texture of the air here was familiar now. The color of the sky, that particular remnant blue that was slightly different from Home's blue in ways he couldn't name but would have noticed immediately if it changed, was familiar. The sound of Beacon's bells marking the hour was a sound he organized his mornings around. And the people. He thought about the people, and the roof was quiet around him, and the morning was cold and clear. It had started accumulating without announcement. The first thing was small. Weiss had begun leaving a second coffee cup on the common room table on mornings when she knew he'd be passing through before her team was awake. She never mentioned it. He never mentioned it. The cup appeared, he drank it, and if the coffee was made correctly, stronger than Remnant's standard, with the particular ratio he'd mentioned offhand to RWBY 4 weeks ago, that was simply a fact about the morning and not a declaration of anything. But he noticed. And he thought, with the careful internal precision of someone who'd learned to read intention through action rather than words, that she had noticed him noticing and had continued anyway. Weiss Schnee communicated in gestures. He'd figured this out in week 6, when she'd revised his filing format for the mission contact reports he submitted to Glinda. Not asking, just appearing at his desk with corrections that were technically optional and practically essential. And he'd realized that this was how she showed regard. Not warmth, because warmth required a vulnerability she rationed carefully, but investment. Attention applied with precision to the things that mattered to you. If Weiss Schnee was correcting your paperwork, she cared about you. The paperwork was incidental. He'd started leaving the reports slightly wrong in specific ways just to see her come back. He was aware this was not behavior becoming a person of good judgment. He did it anyway. The second thing happened in week 7. Yang had come back from a solo training session with a split knuckle that she was ignoring with the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided minor injuries were beneath acknowledgement. And Naruto had stopped her in the corridor and said, without ceremony, "Let me look at that." "It's fine," she'd said. "I know it's fine. Let me look at it." She'd held out her hand with the expression of someone performing a concession they weren't unhappy to make. He'd examined the split, pressed 2 fingers lightly to the area, and pushed a thread of chakra through the contact. Not enough for full healing, just enough to clean the internal bruising and accelerate the surface closure. The warmth of chakra, when applied for healing, had a specific quality that was different from combat application. It was slower, more deliberate, and it moved through the receiver's system with a thoroughness that most people found noticeable. Yang had gone very still. "What is that?" she'd said quietly, not alarmed. The opposite of alarmed, actually, the stillness of someone encountering something unexpected and finding it was good. "Chakra," he'd said. "Healing application. It won't fix anything serious, but minor damage it can handle." She'd looked at her hand. The split was already closed, the bruising fading. She'd flexed her fingers once. Then she'd looked up at him with an expression that was Yang Zyro long at her most unguarded, the competitive brightness set aside, the easy confidence set aside, just her face with something honest in it. "That felt like," she'd started and then stopped and tried again. "It felt like being warm from the inside." "Yeah," he'd said, "that's about right." She'd looked at him for another moment. Then she'd grinned, and the grin was real and a little rueful, the grin of someone making peace with a thing they hadn't expected. "You're going to be annoying," she'd said, "aren't you?" "Probably," he'd said. She'd laughed, full and easy and real, and walked away down the corridor, and he'd stood there watching her go and thought, well, Blake he'd understood from the rooftop. That had been honest from the first night, 2 people finding the same quiet in the same place, and the particular trust that developed between people who didn't perform for each other. She read her books. He watched the city. They talked when there was something worth saying and didn't when there wasn't. And the proportion of talking to silence had shifted gradually over 3 months in the direction of talking, which he thought of as a meaningful metric. But the thing that had shifted it, the specific event he marked internally as the point where company became closeness, was the night she'd told him about menagerie. He hadn't asked. She'd offered it on a night when the city below was lit up for some Vale festival, and the roof had a clear view of the fireworks over the harbor. And she'd said, with the careful evenness of someone choosing to hand something over rather than being asked for it, "My parents have an island. Menagerie, it's where faunus who couldn't make a place for themselves anywhere else tried to build something." A pause. "I left when I was young, thought the White Fang were building something real, thought I was doing something that mattered." The fireworks reflected in her amber eyes. "I left my parents to go fight for a cause that turned into something I couldn't recognize." He'd thought about that for a moment, then he'd said, "My father died before I was born, sealed a monster into me on the night I arrived. My mother died the same night." He'd paused. "The whole village knew what I was carrying and decided that made me the monster too. I grew up alone in a place full of people." He'd looked at the fireworks. "I know about leaving things to go find something that feels like it matters." Blake had looked at him. "Did you find it?" she'd asked. Yeah, he'd said. Several times, lost some of it, found it again. He'd considered how to finish the thought. I think that's just how it works, the finding and losing and finding again. She'd looked back at the fireworks. I think so too, she'd said quietly. She'd given him her book the next morning. The one she'd been reading the first night he'd met her, the worn paperback with the bent spine and the margin notes in small, precise handwriting. He'd read it in 2 days. He'd put it back on her desk with a note inside that said, "The protagonist's wrong at the end. The village isn't what he left, it's what he built." Those are different things. She'd kept the note. He knew because she'd pressed it flat and it had become a bookmark. He'd seen it 3 times since. He'd never mentioned it. Neither had she. RWBY was a different kind of thing entirely, and the fact that it was different didn't make it smaller. With RWBY, everything had been immediate. From the moment she'd said cool at the sight of a racing gun in a hospital room to the morning on the cliff, when she'd sat beside him in the cold, and offered him the specific comfort of someone who understood carrying something that other people couldn't see. She met him fully every time, without negotiation, without the careful calibration he'd learned to recognize in the others. Not because she was simple, Ruby Rose was not simple. Anyone who spent 10 minutes actually watching her understood that, but because she'd decided he was worth her directness, and she'd committed to it. The moment he'd marked, though the moment that had shifted the specific quality of what they were to each other, was the afternoon 6 weeks in when she'd fallen asleep in the common room while waiting for him to finish a meeting with Ozpin. And he'd come back to find her curled in the chair with her cloak pulled up, and Crescent Rose folded under her arm like a very large stuffed animal. And the sight of it had done something to his chest that he'd had to stand in the doorway for a moment to recover from. He hadn't woken her. He'd gotten a blanket from the supply closet, the kind kept for overnight duty shifts, rough and adequate, and put it over her. And she'd shifted slightly without waking, pulling it around herself with the automatic comfort, seeking of deep sleep. He'd gone to his own quarters and sat on his bed for 20 minutes and had a very frank internal conversation with himself about what he was doing. The conclusion of the conversation was, "You're not doing anything. It's happening to you," which was, he thought, probably the honest answer. He hadn't planned any of this. He hadn't arrived in Remnant with any intention beyond surviving and figuring out how to get home. He hadn't sought out Team RWBY specifically or attached himself to them through calculation. He'd landed in a world alone, and they'd been the people who'd been there. And they were, extraordinary, each of them, in ways that weren't about technique or combat capability, but about the specific quality of who they were as people. And somewhere in 3 months of proximity, his internal landscape had shifted in a way that didn't have a clean perimeter. He knew what this was. He wasn't naive, and he wasn't inexperienced, and he'd spent enough time with Kurama's old irreverent commentary on his emotional life to have a reasonably calibrated sense of his own interior state. He also knew that, in his world, this was something that didn't get complicated in the specific way it would get complicated in most places. Because of who he was, and what he was, and the particular capacity for expansion that the kind of love he'd always carried. The big, indiscriminate, no, fine print love that was his most fundamental characteristic, had always possessed. The question was what it meant here. Yang told him first, because Yang was always going to tell him first. It was after a sparring session. They sparred regularly now, 2 or 3 times a week. The sessions longer and more technically involved as she read his patterns, and he deliberately let his patterns evolve to stay interesting. She'd landed a kinetic burst at close range that he'd taken deliberately, wanting to feel the full output of her semblance at maximum charge, and it had hit him hard enough to move him 6 feet backward and leave a crater in the training hall floor. He'd come out of the slide with a grin that was mostly involuntary. "That's it," he'd said. "That's the ceiling. How does it feel at that output?" "Amazing," she'd said, fist still smoking from the discharge, grinning back with the specific brightness she had after something went right in a fight. Slightly terrifying, mostly amazing. Good, that's the window. Right after that release your aura's recalibrating, that's your vulnerability. 43 milliseconds, roughly. You timed it. To the millisecond. 43, she'd shaken her head, still grinning. Then the grin had changed slightly, not disappearing, but becoming something different, more interior. She'd looked at the crater in the training floor, then at him, and said, "You let me hit you with the full thing." I wanted to know what it felt like. You could have just asked me to describe it. That's less useful, he'd paused. And you needed to land it. You've been pulling that output back because you're worried about going too far in a spar. A silence. How do you know that? She said. Because I watch you fight. You've got 3 levels of output in your semblance, and in training you've been capping at 2. You needed to throw the full thing at something that could take it. He'd looked at her steadily. So I let you. Yang had looked at him for a long time. The grin was gone. Something more serious had taken its place. Not heavy, just real, the expression of someone deciding to put something down they'd been carrying for a while. That's annoying, she said. You do that. You figure out what people need and then you just do it, without making a thing of it. Is it annoying? Yes. A pause. No. Another pause. She stopped, started again. When I was 12, my sister disappeared for 2 years. I looked for her. Yang Zyro Long does not. I don't wait for things to come to me. I go and find them. I make things happen. That's how I'm built. She looked at her hands, the gauntlets, the fists, the specific instrument of a personality that led with impact. Most people find that a lot to deal with. They step back or they try to manage it or I don't find it a lot to deal with, he said. I know, she said. That's the thing, you just match it. You don't try to contain it. A pause. You step toward it. He thought about that. I spent my whole life being too much, he said. Too loud, too stubborn, too much chakra, too much feeling, too much of everything. I know what it's like when people step back from it. He met her eyes. I'm not going to step back from you. Yang was quiet. Then she reached over and punched him in the shoulder. Not hard, not a combat impact, just the specific physical expression that Yang Zyro Long used when words were insufficient and contact was more honest. You, she said, are genuinely the most frustrating person I've ever met. I know. I like it, she said. In case that wasn't clear. It was becoming clear, he said. She laughed, short and real, and walked toward the changing rooms, and at the door she stopped and said without turning, For what it's worth, whatever this is, whatever it's becoming, I'm not scared of it. He watched the door close behind her. He sat in the training hall with the crater at his feet for a moment. Then he thought, okay, so that's Yang. Weiss was last, which he'd expected, and she did it like filing a report, which he'd also expected, and somehow that made it more moving rather than less. She came to his room on a Tuesday evening, knocked precisely, waited precisely, entered when invited with the upright bearing of someone who had practiced this exact approach in her head, and was now executing it with the controlled competence she applied to everything. She was holding a scroll with both hands, which she set on his desk with the careful deliberateness of a diplomatic communique. This is a formal inventory, she said, standing in the middle of the room, meeting his gaze with the unflinching precision of someone who decided that the only dignified way through a difficult thing was directly through it. Of the reasons that I have arrived at a particular conclusion. He looked at the scroll, then at her. Weiss, let me finish, she said, not harsh, precise. I was raised to conduct due diligence before any significant decision. I have conducted due diligence. The inventory covers 8 weeks of observation, 17 relevant interactions, and 4 separate occasions on which you did something that I initially assessed as unnecessary and later determined was in fact exactly what was needed. She straightened slightly. The conclusion I have arrived at is, I know the conclusion, he said gently, a very brief pause. You do, you've been showing it for 2 months. He stood up from the desk where he'd been working and crossed the room, stopping a reasonable distance from her. The coffee, the paperwork corrections, the way you don't look at me when you're saying something that matters to you. He kept his voice easy, because she was holding herself very carefully, and he knew that careful holding was her way of being vulnerable. I know the conclusion, Weiss. Weiss Schnee, heiress to the Schnee Dust Company, top of her year at Beacon, the most technically precise combatant he'd ever watched work, looked at him from across 2 meters of distance and lost, just briefly, the composed control she usually maintained with such exactness. "I don't do this," she said, and it was honest in the way she was only occasionally honest, stripped of performance. "I don't feel things like this and simply permit them. I was not raised to permit them. I was raised to assess them and redirect them and, Weiss. And I have been trying to redirect this for 6 weeks and it has not worked and I find that, Weiss." She stopped. He closed the distance by 1 step. "It's okay," he said. "Whatever you're about to say, it's okay." She looked at him. "I know what this is," she said quietly. "I'm not unintelligent. I understand what's happening. I simply want a pause, something genuinely fragile in it. I want it to be real, not a reaction to circumstance, not proximity and shared danger and novelty. I want it to be a real thing." "It is," he said. He didn't qualify it, didn't hedge. "It is a real thing." Another pause. Something settled in her, not vanishing, just finding its level. She looked at the scroll on his desk. "I spent quite a lot of time on that inventory," she said. "I'll read it," he said. "All of it. It's very detailed. I'd expect nothing less." The very smallest thing happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, something Weiss Schnee shaped that was adjacent to a smile but more considered. She picked up the scroll from his desk and tucked it back under her arm. "I'll keep it," she said, "since you apparently already have the conclusion." She turned toward the door, then stopped. "Naruto?" "Yeah, thank you," she said quietly, "for not making me explain it twice." She left. He sat back down at his desk and looked at the door for a moment. He thought about what he'd told each of them, in his own way, that in his world this wasn't something to complicate. That it wasn't casual, wasn't hidden, wasn't halfway. That if it was what it was complete. None of them had run. He thought about that for a while, with something in his chest that was large and warm and slightly overwhelming. And then he thought about the context of what was coming. Salem, the vanguard. The things Ozpin had told him about the relics, and the maidens, and the specific shape of the threat that had been building in Remnant for longer than its current kingdoms had stood. And he understood that the warmth in his chest and the weight of what was coming were not separate things. They were the same thing, they always were, in his world, in every world. The reason you fought was always the same as the reason the fighting hurt. He had told them together, one evening on the roof that had become their shared geography. All 4 of them and him, at different angles of closeness, the city below and the stars above, and the conversation that he'd started by saying, simply, "I need to tell you something about how things work where I'm from." RWBY had been cross-legged next to him with her shoulder against his arm. Yang had been on his other side, close enough that the warmth of her was a physical constant. Weiss had been standing at the low wall with the city behind her, arms folded, listening. Blake had been sitting separately, back against the roof, access doorframe, book closed in her lap, he'd told them. Directly in the way he'd learned to handle hard things. That in the shinobi world, love wasn't always structured the way it was here, that the life expectancy was different, the stakes were different, and that some people carried enough love that its natural shape was wider than a single recipient. That this wasn't something he'd sought or planned. That it wasn't less because of its size, that if any of them found this unreasonable or uncomfortable, he understood completely, and nothing between them would change because of that answer. The silence afterward had been long, then Yang had said, "So when you healed my hand in the corridor, you weren't just being nice." "I was being nice," he'd said. "Also the other thing—" "And the coffee," Weiss had said from the wall. "What coffee?" RWBY had said. "He knows about the coffee," Weiss had said. "I've been leaving a second cup." Weiss had said to RWBY, in the tone of someone who had decided that full disclosure was structurally necessary at this point. RWBY's silver eyes had gone wide. Then, "Oh," a beat. "Oh, I've been," she'd looked at Naruto. "I thought you just knew I liked coming to find you because—" "You do like it," he'd said. "That part's also true." But also the other thing, he'd agreed. Blake had said nothing for a long time. She'd looked at her book, which was closed, and at the city, and then at him with the careful amber gaze of someone running a full analysis before committing to a response. Then she'd said, "The note you left in the book, the village isn't what he left, it's what he built." "Yeah," he'd said. "You were talking about this." "I was talking about a lot of things," he'd said. "That was one of them." Another silence. Then Ruby had leaned her head against his shoulder, very simply, very completely, the way she did everything without half measures. And Yang had said, "We're going to need to establish some kind of system," in the brisk tone of someone identifying a logistical problem. And Weiss had made a sound that was technically not a laugh, but functionally a laugh. And Blake had opened her book, and then closed it again, and set it aside, which for Blake was the equivalent of a lengthy speech. He'd looked at the sky above Remnant, that particular Remnant sky, different from home's sky in ways he couldn't name, and felt the warmth in his chest expand to something that was simultaneously joyful and aching and complete. 3 days after that evening, General Ironwood's name appeared in Ozpin's communications. He'd been monitoring the situation, the message said, with the careful bureaucratic neutrality of someone who'd been monitoring something without authorization, and was now presenting that as a professional courtesy. The anomalous individual associated with Beacon, the one with the unclassified energy signature and the zero official record, had been observed engaging White Fang operatives and a suspected grim, augmented combatant in the industrial district. Atljan intelligence had identified the grim, augmented combatant as a figure associated with an organization whose threat level was, the message understatedly described, concerning. The message concluded with a meeting request, formal, at a time convenient for Ozpin. "He knows about you," Ozpin said, setting the scroll on his desk. "He's known about me since week 2, Naruto said. He was just deciding what to do about it. And now he's decided. He wants to assess me in person." He paused. "He's going to offer me something. A position, resources, authorization, something that makes me part of Atlas's structure and therefore something Atlas controls." Ozpin looked at him. "You've dealt with institutional politics before." "Hidden village politics," Naruto said. "Which is what you get when you put 13 different organizations with competing interests and shared existential threats in the same general geography." "Yeah, I've dealt with it." He leaned back in his chair. "I'll meet him. I want to see what he's like in person." "And if he demands your cooperation?" "He can demand," Naruto said pleasantly. "I'm not under Atlas jurisdiction. I'm barely under Beacon jurisdiction, no offense." "None taken," Ozpin said, in the tone of someone taking mild offense and deciding to absorb it. "Be careful. Ironwood is not an enemy. He is also not flexible." "I can work with inflexible," Naruto stood. "It's people who won't tell you what they actually want that are hard to work with." He left the office, took the elevator down, and walked out into Beacon's grounds in the afternoon light. The castle of towers and bridges that had been alien geometry 3 months ago was a landmark now, the kind he navigated by without thinking. He knew where the training halls were and the quickest route to the roof, and the specific table in the dining hall that had a sightline to all 3 exits. He knew this place. The meeting with Ironwood was in 2 days. In 4 days, Team RWBY had a classified mission briefing that Ozpin had flagged as significant enough to require direct preparation. And somewhere in the background, Salem was patient and watching and building towards something that had been in construction for longer than kingdoms. He thought about what the Vanguard woman had said. "Choose your village carefully. The one you build here will cost you more than the one you left." He thought about 4 women and a rooftop and a city he was learning to read like home. He thought about cost and about worth, and about the fact that in his experience those 2 things were almost never the same number, and that was fine. That was how things that mattered actually worked. He put his hands in his pockets and walked toward the training halls. He had work to do. The meeting with Ironwood happened in a conference room in Vale's official Huntsman liaison building, neutral ground, which was Ironwood's gesture toward civility, and a room with 2 Atlas guards posted outside. which was Ironwood's reminder that the civility had structural backing. The general was a large man. Not in the way that Yang was large. Yang's size was physical and immediate and honest about what it meant. Ironwood was large in the more complex sense of someone who had built himself into an institution, who wore authority the way a building wore its architecture, as something load, bearing and not incidental. Metal arm. Military posture. The eyes of someone who had made enough difficult decisions that the difficulty had been refined out of the process, leaving only the certainty. He looked at Naruto for a long moment before speaking. "You're younger than the reports suggested," he said. "The reports are accurate," Naruto said. "I'm just not what you were expecting." "No," Ironwood agreed. "You're not." He sat. A gesture invited Naruto to sit. "I'll be direct." "Good," Naruto said. "I prefer that." "You are an unregistered combatant operating in Vale's jurisdiction with no documentation, no identifiable origin, and an energy signature that none of my analysts can classify. You have engaged White Fang operatives on 2 confirmed occasions and a grim, augmented combatant on 1. Your capability assessment, based on observational data, puts you above anything in Beacon's current student population and most of its faculty." A pause. "And you've been integrated into one of Beacon's first-year teams in a capacity that Ozpin has described to me as a consultancy." "That's accurate," Naruto said. "What I want," Ironwood said, "is for you to work with Atlas." "No," Naruto said, a pause. "I haven't finished the offer." "The offer is resources and authorization and a formal structure that puts you in a position to direct my activities," Naruto said. "And I understand why that's attractive from your perspective. I'm a variable you can't account for, and you'd rather have me accounted for. I understand that completely. But no." Ironwood's jaw tightened slightly. "You understand the threat that's building in this world." "I'm beginning to." "Then you understand that an uncoordinated response is." "What I understand," Naruto said, and kept his voice even because this wasn't a fight. It was a negotiation, and the difference mattered. "Is that the threat you're describing has been building for longer than Atlas has existed. It's been building since before the kingdoms. Your institutional response, as competent as it is not going to be sufficient on its own. You know that. That's why you're here." He met Ironwood's gaze. "You don't want my cooperation because you think it'll help the institution. You want it because you're scared, and scared people look for more resources." The silence was long. "I'm not wrong," Naruto said, "and I'm not saying it to be rude." Ironwood looked at him. The certainty in his eyes was still there, but something else had entered, the specific expression of a man encountering an assessment that was accurate and uncomfortable in equal measure. "What would you accept?" he said finally. "Information sharing," Naruto said. "Anything Atlas Intelligence has on Salem's movements, I want access to. In return, I'll report contact events, what I encounter, what I assess, what my senses tell me that your instruments can't." He paused. "I don't operate under your authority. But I'm not your enemy, and I'm not indifferent to what happens to this world. Those 2 things can coexist." Another long pause. "And if I say that's insufficient," Ironwood said, Naruto looked at him pleasantly, "then we've had a polite meeting and I'll walk out and nothing will change because you don't have a mechanism to compel me and we both know it." He paused. "But I don't think you'll say that. Because the information sharing is more useful to you than forcing a confrontation with someone whose capabilities you can't fully assess." Ironwood studied him for a very long moment. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a man making a concession he'd already calculated was necessary. "Information sharing," he said. "Conditional on, don't attach conditions you can't enforce," Naruto said. "It makes the agreement messy." The corner of Ironwood's mouth did something that was technically not amusement. "You negotiate like someone who's done this before." "I've sat across from the leaders of hidden villages," Naruto said. "Cage summits, full-scale geopolitical negotiations with the fate of multiple nations on the table." He shrugged. "This is a Tuesday." Something moved in Ironwood's expression, not quite respect, but its precursor. the specific reassessment of someone encountering competence they hadn't fully anticipated. He extended his hand. "Information sharing," he said. "No conditions." Naruto shook it. "I'll be in touch when there's something worth sharing." He stood, walked to the door, opened it, nodded to the Atlas guards, who looked at him with the specific expression of soldiers who'd been waiting for a conflict that hadn't materialized, and walked out into the Vale afternoon. Behind him, in the conference room, General Ironwood sat alone for a moment, then he picked up his scroll and made a call. "Run the full observational file again," he said when it connected. "Everything. I want to understand what that seal does." That night on the roof, Naruto told Team RWBY about the meeting. Yang laughed at the Ironwood exchange for 45 seconds. Weiss said, "You told a general that he couldn't enforce his conditions and that the conversation was a Tuesday." "It was accurate." "It was," she said. "Also extremely on brand." Ruby was beaming. Blake had the expression she had when she found something genuinely funny and was declining to show it fully, which meant the corner of her mouth was doing work that the rest of her face was refusing to acknowledge. "He'll be fine," Naruto said. "He's not a bad person. He's just inflexible and scared inflexible people aren't actually that hard to work with once you establish what you can and can't give them." "What you can't give them," Yang said, "is apparently everything they ask for. Almost everything." He paused. "The information sharing I meant, I'll actually hold up that end. And the part where you don't operate under his authority. Also meant," he said, "I don't operate under authority that isn't mine to accept." He looked at the four of them, at Ruby close beside him, at Yang sprawled with the comfortable ease of someone who'd stopped performing casual and started actually being it, at Weiss standing at the wall with the city behind her, at Blake with her book closed in her lap. "The only authority I've ever really accepted," he said, "is people I'd take a hit for." The roof was quiet. "That's a very high bar," Weiss said finally. "Yeah," he said, "but it's not a bar I don't trust any of you to clear." The quiet that followed was the good kind. The kind that didn't need anything added to it. Below them, Vale went about its evening, lit and warm and ordinary, with no idea about the things in motion above its geography, or the boy from somewhere else who'd landed in its forest 3 months ago and was, quietly and completely, building something that felt, if not quite like home, then like the beginning of one. Chapter 5, The Fox and the Grim. The alert came at 3 in the morning. Not a grim incursion, the sensor arrays that ringed Vale's perimeter were calibrated for grim signatures specifically. The cold null, life reading that his own senses had catalogued in the first week. This was different. This came through Beacon's general alert system as a Category 2 security event, unidentified aerial contact, approaching from the northwest at altitude, running no standard identification signal. Naruto was awake before the alert finished sounding. Not because he'd been sleeping lightly, he slept the way he'd always slept, completely and immediately. The soldier's habit of taking unconsciousness where it was offered, because you never knew when the next window would come. He was awake because his senses had caught the approach 40 seconds before the electronic systems did, and his body had processed threat before his conscious mind had finished the translation. He was at the window of his quarters with his hand on the frame, looking northwest, when the alert tone cut through Beacon's corridors. The approaching contact was large. Mechanical, he could feel the absence of life energy in it the way he felt the absence of life energy in Grimm, but different. Grimm's emptiness was organic, the emptiness of something that existed in opposition to life. This was the emptiness of something that had never been alive. Metal and dust and engineering, moving with the specific purposefulness of a guided system rather than the instinctual drive of a creature. He'd felt Atlas's technology often enough in the past 3 months to recognize its signature. He got dressed in 30 seconds and was in the corridor when Ruby's door opened and she emerged with crescent rows already assembled. Silver eyes sharp with the combat. Switch that he'd watched flip in her a dozen times now. The interior change that took Ruby rose from earnest and enthusiastic to something older and more focused, the part of her that had been shaped by loss and grief into something that hit like a scythe. "What is it?" she said. "Atlas," he said. "Mechanical, big." Her eyes went flat. "Ironwood?" "Probably not directly. He's smarter than a frontal approach." He paused. "Someone gave an order he didn't stop." Yang's door opened, then Weiss's. Blake materialized from the stairwell end of the corridor. She'd already been in the corridor, he realized, which meant she'd felt the approach through something instinctual rather than the alert, and he filed that away as a thing to understand better later. "Roof," he said. "All of you behind me. I want to see what we're dealing with before anyone engages." The Paladin descended through Vale's cloud cover at the kind of slow, deliberate pace that announced capability rather than urgency. It was a statement, the approach speed of something that wasn't afraid of what it was approaching. From Beacon's roof, in the gray dawn with the city lights below and the clouds breaking around the descending shape. It looked enormous, 6 meters of Atlas military engineering. The Paladin-class combat frame that Naruto had heard referenced in the intelligence files Ironwood had shared. The ones that described the unit's purpose as high threat neutralization in environments where conventional huntsman assets are insufficient. The specifications had described capabilities. Looking at it now, descending toward Beacon's grounds with its targeting systems cycling visibly in the dark, the faint red sweep of active sensors, the hydraulic movement of its weapon arrays coming to ready position. He understood the gap between specifications and reality. It was built to fight something specific. The proportions were wrong for standard grim engagement. The targeting array was calibrated for a specific energy signature. He recognized the calibration because it had been designed against data that only one source in Vale could have provided. It was built to fight him. Behind him, Yang said very quietly, "Ironwood." "Someone under him," Naruto said. "This was authorized, not ordered. There's a difference." "Does the difference matter right now?" Weiss said, with the flat precision of someone setting aside the political analysis in favor of the immediate problem. "It matters for after," he said. "Right now." He watched the Paladin complete its descent, landing on Beacon's outer grounds with a concussive impact that cracked the stone beneath its feet and sent shockwave ripples through the grass in a perfect ring. "Right now, I need everyone to stay back." "Naruto," RWBY started. "Not because I don't trust you," he said. He turned and looked at them, all 4 of them, in the pre-dawn dark, expressions ranging from RWBY's worried focus to Yang's barely contained fury to Weiss's controlled assessment to Blake's quiet, watchful readiness. "Because I need to understand what this thing can do, and I can't do that cleanly if I'm worried about your positioning." He held RWBY's gaze specifically because she was the most likely to follow him anyway. "Please." A beat, she nodded. Short, unhappy, real. He turned back to the Paladin. "Dropped off the rooftop." The fall was 4 stories, and he landed without breaking stride, hitting Beacon's grounds in a controlled drop that absorbed the impact through his legs and kept him moving forward. The Paladin's targeting array found him immediately. He felt the scans sweep over him, the mechanical equivalent of being looked at, cold and comprehensive. A speaker system on the unit's chassis activated. The voice that came through it was filtered, official, and careful in the way of someone reading from a prepared statement. "Unidentified combatant. By authority of the Atlas Military Council, you are instructed to stand down and submit to assessment and containment protocol. Non-compliance will result in—" "Who gave the order?" Naruto said. A pause. The prepared statement had not accounted for an immediate question. "Non-compliance will result in—" "I'm not non-complying," he said. "I'm asking a question. Who authorized this deployment?" He stopped 10 meters from the Paladin and looked at it the way he'd looked at Payne's 6 bodies, not with fear, but with the specific professional attention of someone taking inventory. "Ironwood knows I'm not a threat to Vale. He agreed to information sharing 3 weeks ago. So someone under him made a decision he didn't sanction." He paused. I'd like to know who because it affects how I handle what happens next, the speaker crackled. Then went silent, the paladin's weapon array deployed. Okay, he said, we'll do it this way. The first shot was a dust, accelerated kinetic round. He felt it coming from the barrel pressure change. The dust crystal resonance spiking a quarter second before discharge. And he wasn't there when it arrived. He moved laterally, fast enough that the round passed through the space he'd occupied and impacted the ground behind him with an explosion of displaced stone that sent debris arcing across Beacon's outer grounds. The paladin tracked him. Fast, faster than the White Fang's equipment, faster than anything he'd encountered in Remnant yet. Atlas engineering at its ceiling. He moved again. The second round clipped the air 6 inches from his left arm. He felt the displaced pressure of it, the wake of a projectile moving faster than sound. He adjusted his assessment upward. Okay, this thing is serious. The third round he let hit. Not recklessly, he angled his body to take the impact on his right side. Chakra, reinforced to maximum density, the specific preparation of someone who needed information that only contact could provide. The round hit him like a boulder. It moved him 15 feet sideways, his boots leaving trenches in Beacon's lawn, and he felt the impact travel through his skeletal structure and register, as significant in the specific way that things registered as significant when his body was running full physical reinforcement, and still felt them. He came out of the skid with a complete assessment. Kinetic output, upper end of what he'd calculated. Tracking speed, exceptional. Reload cycle, 1.8 seconds between shots. The targeting system was excellent. It led his movements rather than following them, predicting trajectory from velocity vectors. Against a conventional combatant, it would be essentially unanswerable. He rolled his right shoulder. Felt the deep structural impact fade as his healing rate handled it. Fine, he thought. Let's go. He went at it fast. Not his ceiling, not yet, but faster than the tracking system's predictive model was calibrated for. He felt the model struggling to update as he broke the pattern it had established from his first 3 movements, changing direction without the velocity cues that trajectory prediction depended on. The next 3 shots went wide. Not by much, the system was adapting, but wide. He got inside its range. At close distance, the paladin switched from ranged weapons to direct engagement, and the shift was immediate and powerful. A hydraulic strike from its left arm that he ducked under, feeling the displaced air of it passing inches above his head. And then he was inside that too, hands on the frame. Pushing chakra into the contact points the way he'd learned to push chakra into anything he needed to understand. The machine was excellent engineering. It was also, at its core, a system. Systems had logic. Logic had structure. Structure had the specific kind of weakness that came from being designed for a specific threat profile. This paladin had been built to fight a target with his energy signature, which meant it had been calibrated against the baseline data Ironwood's team had collected. It knew his chakra output at rest and at moderate exertion. It knew his movement speed from the observational data. It did not know what he looked like when he stopped holding back. He pushed chakra through both hands at combat output, not full, not Kurama. Just his own, the vast reserves that the Uzumaki bloodline had produced and the years of training had refined, the kind of output that had won wars in his world. He pushed it through the contact points with the specific intention of disrupting rather than destroying, targeting the dust crystal network that powered the unit systems, the same way he disrupted the Vanguard woman's puppet threads, forcing the crystals to resonate with his chakra frequency instead of their programmed operational frequency. The Paladin's system stuttered. Not shut down, military engineering had redundancies, but the targeting array went dark for 3 seconds, and the weapon systems locked in safe mode, and the hydraulic responses slowed by 40% as the unit's operational intelligence tried to address the interference. In 3 seconds, he moved to the targeting array specifically, pushed a concentrated burst through the sensor housing and felt the predictive tracking system fry. The paladin could still fight, but it couldn't see him the same way anymore. He stepped back to 10 meters and watched it reorient, the targeting array running on backup systems now slower and less sophisticated. The weapon array deployed again. "You can keep going," he said, to whoever was listening through the unit's communication system. "But you're down your primary targeting. The next 10 minutes are going to go badly for your machine." A long pause. The paladin's weapon array held position. Then, slowly, it began to retract. Above, on the roof, Yang's fist hit the parapet hard enough to crack the stone. "He just walked up to it," she said. Her voice had an edge in it that wasn't anger exactly. Anger was something Yang moved through quickly, burning fuel efficiently. This was something slower and more structural. A 6-meter Atlas combat frame, and he just walked up to it. "And disabled its targeting system," Weiss said, in the tone of someone narrating a thing they were still processing. "With his hands." "The chakra disruption," Blake said quietly. She'd been watching with the specific attention she brought to things that connected to other things. "It's the same mechanism he used on the Vanguard's puppet technique, forcing a frequency mismatch through direct contact." "He took a direct hit," Ruby said. Her voice was careful in a way that meant she was managing something. "He took it deliberately," Blake said. "He wanted to assess the output." "I know why he took it," Ruby said. "That doesn't—" She stopped. Yang looked at her. "Hey!" "I know he's fine," Ruby said. "I can see he's fine." "It's just—" She pressed her lips together. "It's the watching part, the standing here part." Yang put her arm around Ruby's shoulders, said nothing because there wasn't anything to say that Ruby didn't already know. Below, the paladin completed its weapon retraction and began a slow, retreating ascent. Naruto stood in the middle of Beacon's damaged outer grounds and watched it go, hands loose at his sides, and even from 4 stories up Ruby could read his posture, not triumph, not relief. Just the settled quality of someone who'd done the math and gotten the answer they expected. The paladin cleared the cloud cover and was gone. Ironwood called at 4:15 a.m. Naruto took the call in Ozpin's office, with Ozpin present but silent at his desk, reading the events report Glinda had compiled while listening. "The deployment was unauthorized," Ironwood said, directly. The specific directness of someone who had already handled the internal consequence and was now managing the external one. "The officer responsible has been removed from active duty pending full review." "I know," Naruto said. "The prepared statement was too careful for something you'd sanction. Someone read the intelligence file and made a decision you didn't make." He paused. "I'm not calling it an Atlas attack. I'm calling it a mistake made by someone in your organization." A pause. "That's a more generous framing than I expected." "I told you I'm not your enemy," Naruto said. "I meant it, but I need you to understand something." He kept his voice level and let the weight of what he was about to say carry itself without assistance. "The unit was built specifically to engage me. That means someone in your organization has been running a parallel development track since at least 3 weeks ago, before we had our meeting, probably before you decided to reach out. The information sharing agreement was made in good faith. If that good faith is being undermined by a faction in your organization, that's a problem for both of us." A long silence. "I'll conduct a full internal review," Ironwood said. "Good." He paused. "The targeting system is fried. You can have the unit recovered from Beacon's grounds. It landed a bit hard on its retreat." He paused again. "I didn't destroy it. I could have." "I'm aware," Ironwood said. "Then we understand each other," Naruto said. He ended the call. Ozpin, from behind his desk, said, "You're very calm about this." "I'm not calm," Naruto said. "I'm controlled. There's a difference." Ozpin looked at him. What would not calm look like? Naruto thought about the impact, the round hitting him. The specific feeling of they built something to put me down that had registered somewhere below the tactical assessment and above the physical response, in the part of him that had spent his childhood being the thing people wanted contained. "It would look like a different conversation," he said. "One I don't want to have. He stood and walked toward the elevator, stopped. Ozpin? Yes. The Paladin was a test. Not by the officer who authorized it, he was acting on fear and poor judgment. But whoever fed him the intelligence file, whoever built the counter, specification into the unit's targeting system, that was deliberate. He turned to look at the headmaster. Someone in Atlas's intelligence structure has a more detailed file on me than Ironwood admitted to. That means they've been running surveillance that goes beyond the observational data from campus. Ozpin was very still. Someone's been feeding them information, Naruto said. From closer than Ironwood's external observation teams. The silence was long. I'll look into it, Ozpin said quietly. So will I, Naruto said and left. The weeks after the Paladin incident had the quality of a held breath. Ironwood's internal review produced 2 reassignments and a formal communication to beacon that read, between its careful diplomatic lines, as an apology with structural backing. The intelligence leak investigation produced nothing confirmed, but 2 probable leads that Ozpin's people were monitoring quietly. The Atlas-Beacon relationship continued with the specific strained civility of institutions that needed each other, and were currently managing an injury to that mutual necessity. And Salem moved, not directly. Nothing about Salem was direct. The intelligence Naruto had been accumulating from Ozpin's briefings and Ironwood's, shared files and Blake's knowledge of the militant White Fang's communication patterns, painted a picture of someone who had been patient for so long that patience wasn't a quality she possessed so much as a thing. She was. But the grim activity in the Eastern Territories had been increasing for 3 weeks, not random incursions, the kind that happened when negative emotion pooled in population centers, but organized, directed. Grim moving in patterns that corresponded to no natural behavioral model, herded toward specific geographic points along Vale's outer defensive line. She's mapping the gaps, Naruto said in Ozpin's office, looking at the grim movement overlay that the headmaster had spread across the strategy table. She's not attacking. She's finding the places the defenses don't cover cleanly. He pointed to 3 separate points on the map where the movement patterns converged. These 3 locations. She's going to probe here, here, and here simultaneously, not to breach, but to force a response deployment that thins coverage elsewhere. Ozpin looked at the points. That assessment matches what my own people have suggested, he said slowly. When? Within the week. Based on the acceleration pattern, he paused. I'm deploying Team CFVY to the Eastern Line as the primary response. Their second year, the strongest team I have available for extended field operation. I want to be on the Eastern Line, Naruto said. Ozpin looked at him. Team RWBY comes too, he said. Not as primary, as mobile reserve. If Team CFV's line holds, they don't engage. If it breaks, he left the end of that conditional in the air. Ozpin was quiet for a moment. You're expecting it to break. I'm expecting Salem to be smarter than a single probe, Naruto said. She's been doing this longer than Vale's existed. A 3-point simultaneous probe isn't her ceiling. It's her opening move. The Eastern Line, when they reached it, was a stretch of forest and open terrain that Vale's defensive infrastructure thinned to a series of automated turret systems and manual patrol routes. The gap between the heavier fortified sections that covered the main approach corridors. Naruto had studied the map enough to know that the automated systems had a 40-meter blind zone along the ridgeline to the northeast, which was either an oversight or a deliberate limitation. And in his experience, there was no such thing as a coincidence in defensive architecture. Team CFVY deployed along the primary line. Team RWBY took the ridge. The night was cold and clear, better visibility than cloud cover would have allowed, which was something. He could feel the grim before the visual contact, the specific null, life emptiness spreading through the forest below like a stain in clear water, multiple signatures, moving with the coordination he'd been tracking on the maps. 60 plus, he said quietly to the earpiece comm. Main cluster south, southeast. Secondary clusters flanking at 200 meters on each side. She's running a 3-column approach. RWBY crouched 3 meters to his right with crescent rows extended to sniper configuration. Team CF in position on the main line. They can handle the primary cluster. The flanking columns are going to bypass them, Blake said from his left. She'd found a position with sightline to both flanks, which was, he'd learned, exactly how Blake approached positions: maximum information, minimum exposure. Those aren't headed for Team CFVY. They're headed for the turret systems. She wants the automated coverage down, Weiss said, through the comm from her position 50 meters back, maintaining the glyph network. If the turrets go offline, the gap widens to the secondary access road, which leads directly to the residential district. Yang finished. She was the only one of them who sounded almost eager, which was a Yang Zyro long characteristic that he'd come to understand as not bloodlust, but the specific way her nervous system processed danger, by moving toward it rather than waiting for it. Okay, so the flanking columns are ours. Right flank yours, Naruto said. Left flank Blake and Weiss. RWBY, you stay mobile, fill wherever the line is thinnest. He paused. Try to keep the turret systems intact. We need the coverage. And you, RWBY said. I'm going to figure out what's behind all 3 columns, he said. Because this is still the opening move. RWBY looked at him. The moonlight caught her silver eyes, that specific silver that was something older than her, something the world had put there for reasons he was still learning. Be careful, she said. He smiled at her, brief, real. Coming from you, that's almost funny. I'm serious, I know. He met her eyes for one more second. I will, he moved. The fight for the Eastern Line lasted 47 minutes. Later, in the official debrief, it would be described as a successful defensive engagement, both flanking columns neutralized before reaching the turret systems. Team CFV's primary line holding against the main cluster with acceptable aura expenditure. Total structural damage to Vale's defensive infrastructure within recoverable parameters. The official debrief did not fully capture what the 47 minutes felt like from inside it. Yang took the right flank alone, and it was, objectively, one of the most impressive things Naruto had seen in Remnant. Yang Zyro long in a sustained engagement, absorbing kinetic impacts from Beowulf strikes and converting them to output. Moving through a coordinated Grim column with the specific controlled violence of someone who knew exactly how hard she could hit and had decided that was not a reason for restraint. She burned through a significant portion of her semblance's charge cycle, and she held the flank. Blake and Weiss on the left were a different kind of impressive. The precision pairing, Weiss's glyph network creating choke points that Blake's speed used as operational infrastructure. The two of them working with the efficiency of a system that had been refined through months of understanding each other's rhythms. They held their flank. RWBY moved where she was needed, which was everywhere crescent rows covering sightlines that the others couldn't reach, her speed making her effective across a range that no single combatant should have been able to cover. She held the center. Naruto, meanwhile, had moved past the 3 columns. What was behind them was not what he'd expected, not another Grim column, not a larger creature acting as command element. What was behind the 3-column approach, positioned at the edge of the forest where the tree line broke to open ground, was a single figure, standing absolutely still, watching the engagement through some means that wasn't line of sight because the distance was too great and the night too dark. He recognized the energy signature, not the vanguard woman from the warehouse. Different, but the same category, that deep, reserves, heavy, long, accumulated power that spoke of something carried for decades rather than years. The shadow, adjacent quality, grim, adjacent but distinct, the signature of someone who had been in proximity to Salem's influence for long enough that it had become structural. The figure turned when he was still 30 meters out, female. Young, looking in the way that people who weren't actually young sometimes looked, the face of someone whose physical presentation had stopped updating at a certain point while the eyes continued accumulating. dark complexion, ember, orange eyes, and an expression of absolute composure that had been worn long enough to become indistinguishable from actual composure. "You separated from your team," she said. Her voice was quiet and even, carrying clearly in the night air. "You're not part of the attack." He said, "You're the reason it's where it is. You positioned those columns." "Yes. The attack itself doesn't matter," he said, feeling through the logic of it as he spoke. "The columns are a distraction. You're the real objective of this exercise." He stopped 10 meters from her. "But you're not here to fight me. If you were, you would have done it before I separated." "Correct," she said. "Then what?" She looked at him with the ember eyes. "I was sent to deliver something," she said. "Not a message this time, something more direct." Her hand extended, palm up, and resting in it was a small object, crystalline, dark, the size of his thumbnail, with an interior quality that his senses found profoundly difficult to process. It felt like compressed distance, like a door folded into a stone. "She made this for you specifically?" He didn't take it. "What does it do?" "It opens a bridge," the woman said. "Between here and the rift that brought you, not a permanent connection, an hour, perhaps less, enough to communicate, enough to send something through." A pause. "She thought you might want to tell someone where you are." The breath went out of him, not visibly. He controlled it well enough that it wasn't visible, but it went out, and what replaced it was something he'd been keeping in a very specific interior compartment for 3 months. The compartment labeled home that he opened rarely and closed quickly, because the opening and closing hurt in ways that the fighting never did. He could tell Sakura where he was. He could tell Kakashi. He could send something to the Hokage's office, to the village, to the people who were almost certainly. He looked at the crystal. "Why?" he said. "What does she get from it?" "She gets the measure of what you want most." The woman said, without disguising it. "She gets to know whether you're a man who would trade anything for the door home or a man who would refuse even that on principle." The ember eyes were direct. "She's been collecting this information about what moves you, what doesn't." "She's building a model," he said. "Of my decision-making?" "Yes, so she can predict me." "So she can plan around you," the woman said. "Which is different. She doesn't want to fight you. She finds you," a pause, "genuinely interesting, which is not a common experience for her." He looked at the crystal for a long time. He thought about Sakura's face, about Kakashi's eye, crinkle when he was actually amused, about the Hokage mountain and ramen at Ikaraku and the specific smell of Konoha in the summer. He thought about the compartment he'd kept closed for 3 months and what was inside it and how much it weighed. Then he thought about what accepting the crystal meant, about what it told Salem, about the model she was building and what she'd do with the data point of Naruto Uzumaki will accept anything that offers him a door home. He thought about the roof, about coffee left on a table, about amber eyes and a closed book used as a bookmark for a note he'd written, about the training hall and a crater and 43 milliseconds, about silver eyes in a hospital room saying cool. He thought about what the Vanguard had said 3 months ago. Choose your village carefully. He'd already chosen. "No," he said. The woman looked at him. The ember eyes didn't change. She'd expected both answers equally. "You understand what you're refusing?" "A chance to tell people I care about that I'm alive," he said. "Yeah, I understand." He held her gaze. "Tell her the answer was no. And tell her I know she's going to find that data point useful. I know it tells her something about how I make decisions." He paused. "Let her use it, because the conclusion she'll draw is correct. I'm not a man who can be moved by doors. I can only be moved by people." He paused one more time. "And the people who can move me are behind me, not through that bridge." A long silence. The woman closed her hand around the crystal. The ember eyes held something that was not quite respect, too old and complicated for that simple word, but was its functional equivalent. "She'll want to meet you?" The woman said, "Eventually." "I know," he said. "I'll be here." She turned and walked into the tree line, and the shadows took her in the way shadows didn't, and she was gone. He heard it before he turned. The specific sound of an aura field shattering, the sharp crystal, break quality of structural integrity going to 0, followed by a body hitting the ground. He was already moving before the sound finished registering. Turning, sprinting back toward the engagement zone, his senses extending at full passive range, and finding what they found and hitting him like the paladin's kinetic round had, somewhere below the tactical and above the physical. Yang was down. He found her at the edge of the right flank engagement zone where the column's rear element had doubled back. A tactic, he realized with cold fury, that had been part of the design. The three-column approach had been designed with a rear element held back specifically to catch the flank huntsman after their aura was depleted from the primary engagement. Salem's columns weren't dumb grim, they'd been directed. The timing had been calculated. Yang's aura was at 0. She was conscious, barely, head up, one gauntlet raised, but her aura was gone, and a seer grim was hovering 6 feet above her. The seers were Salem's intelligence instruments, the floating eyeball creatures that fed information directly to the central consciousness they served. They were also, when they chose to be, weapons. The tentacles extended from its body were poised. He covered the distance in less than a second. What came out of him was not a decision. It was the embers. 3 months of deep, banked quiet, the Kurama essence that had been dissolved into him on the other side of a dimensional rift, ignited. Not with the slow build of deliberate transformation, not with the conscious draw of someone choosing to access a power mode. It came up the way fire came up when something combustible finally reached its ignition point. It came up because Yang was on the ground with her aura gone, and a seer hovering above her, and the part of him that had carried Kurama for 17 years knew, without consultation, what this moment required. The chakra cloak erupted. Orange, gold, and vast, the kind of light that came with heat, real, physical heat, that the surrounding air registered as a temperature spike measurable at 50 meters. The 9 Tails chakra mode in its first form was a coating, a living layer of chakra shaped by will and emotion, and the shape it took was specific to the moment that called it. 4 tails, manifested in pure chakra, the enormous silhouette of something ancient and furious and protective rising behind and around him like a second presence. The seer recoiled, not retreated. Grim didn't retreat, not from threat, but recoiled, the way living things moved when they encountered something older and more fundamental than whatever instinct had been programmed into them. The seer's tentacles pulled back, its enormous eye oriented on the chakra cloak, and something that passed through its alien biology resembled, if nothing else, recognition. Naruto stood between it and Yang, burning orange, gold in the dark, and looked at the seer. "Leave," he said. The seer left. It moved backward, then turned and accelerated into the night sky, gone in seconds. The remaining grim at the edges of the engagement zone, the rear element that had been closing on Yang's position, scattered, not tactically, instinctively. The way they'd scattered from his crater in the Emerald Forest 3 months ago, the specific flight response that the chakra produced in them. The reaction he'd never fully understood but had noticed from the first day. He let the cloak recede. It went slowly, not because he chose the pacing, but because it took time for the ignition to bank back down, the Kurama embers flaring bright, and then settling, bright, and then settling, the orange light fading in pulses until he was just himself again in the dark, breathing harder than he had been. He dropped to his knees beside Yang. She was looking at him. Her lilac eyes were fully open, fully conscious, and they had an expression in them that he'd never seen on Yang Xiao Long, not the brightness, not the challenge, not the competitive directness. Something quieter and more fundamental than any of those, the expression of someone who had been in real danger and been reached at the last second by something they hadn't expected. "Hey," she said. Her voice was rough. "Hey," he said. "That was." She stopped, started again. There was a fox." "Yeah," he said, "kind of, a really big fox." He'd say enormous, Naruto said, and felt the Kurama embers pulse once at that, and something moved in his chest that was grief and love in proportions he couldn't separate. "But yes, big fox." Yang looked at him. Her hand came up, still in the gauntlet, still warm from the semblance discharge, and settled against his jaw in the careful way of someone whose arm wasn't working at full capacity. "You came back fast," she said. "I was already on my way," he said. From where? He thought about the crystal, about the woman with ember eyes, about the door he'd refused and what refusing it had meant. "Doesn't matter," he said. "I'm here." Yang's thumb moved slightly against his jaw. She was cataloging him, not flirtatiously, not strategically, the way you checked something you'd been scared of losing. Her eyes moved over his face with the thoroughness of someone taking inventory. "The cloak," she said, quieter. "When it came up, was that Kurama?" he said. "What's left of him?" He paused, finding the right words. "He's still in there, not as himself, but as something. And apparently he stopped again. "When you're what?" she said. He looked at her. Lying in the torn-up grass at the edge of a forest, aura depleted, asking him a question with the directness that was her most fundamental quality even right now. Especially right now. "When you're in danger," he finished. "He has opinions about that." Yang was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tell him," she said. "I said thanks." The embers pulsed, warm, brief, definite. "He heard you," Naruto said. The light came from RWBY. He felt it before he saw it, the specific quality of energy that he'd been cataloging since the first time he'd sat with RWBY on the cliff, and understood that what she carried was something Remnant had built for a purpose he didn't yet fully understand. Silver in the way that went deeper than color. Old in the same way that the wound in Remnant's natural energy was old, connected to whatever had produced that wound, or to whatever had been meant to address it. He turned. RWBY was standing at the center of the engagement zone with crescent rows lowered and her eyes open, and the light coming out of them was the kind of light that didn't seem to care about physics in the way conventional light did. It went everywhere at once. It found the grim at the edges of the zone, and it didn't burn them. It unmade them, the specific dissolution of creatures whose fundamental nature was in opposition to what the light was made of. The grim dissolved, all of them. Everything within the light's range, which extended further than RWBY seemed to have intended. The silver expanding in a sphere that covered the entire engagement zone and the tree line beyond it, dissolving 24 grim in the space of 4 seconds with the quiet thoroughness of something that had always been inevitable. Then RWBY's legs went out from under her. Naruto caught her before she hit the ground. She was barely conscious. The silver eyes had gone back to normal, the light gone, and she was pale and shaking with the specific exhaustion of someone who'd spent a resource their body hadn't been ready to spend. He lowered her to the ground, one arm around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed in ragged pulls. "RWBY," he said. "I'm okay," she said, muffled against his shoulder. "I'm okay, I saw the seer and I saw Yang down and I couldn't." "I know," he said. "I know." "You're okay." She gripped his jacket with both hands and he held her and let her shake. Blake and Weiss arrived 60 seconds later. He heard their approach before they arrived. Felt the specific familiar quality of their life energy. And when they reached him, Blake knelt immediately beside RWBY and put one hand on her shoulder and said her name quietly. And Weiss stood 3 feet away with an expression that was doing the thing it did when she was trying to contain something large. Yang had gotten herself to sitting. She looked at RWBY in his arms and said very quietly, "Hey, Rubes!" RWBY turned her head, found Yang. The relief that crossed her face was total and immediate, the expression of someone whose worst fear had just been directly contradicted. "Hey," RWBY said. "Big Fox saved me," Yang said. "No big deal." RWBY made a sound that was simultaneously a laugh and not a laugh. "I know," she said. "I saw." Were your eyes doing the thing?" "I think so," RWBY said. "I couldn't really control it. You dissolved like 30 grim. Was it 30? RWBY looked at him as if he'd been counting. "Closer to 35, he said. RWBY turned back to Yang. 35? She said with a slightly delirious accuracy. Yang looked at her sister for a long moment, taking inventory the same way she'd taken inventory of Naruto. Then she reached over, wincing with the effort of a body running on 0 aura, and flicked RWBY in the forehead. "Oh," RWBY said. That's for scaring me, Yang said. Her voice was completely steady. The silver eyes thing is cool, but also I aged 5 years watching it happen. You were unconscious. I woke up right at the end, still counts. Naruto sat in the torn, up grass of Vale's eastern defense line with RWBY against his shoulder, and Yang 3 feet away arguing with her and Blake's hand still on RWBY's shoulder, and Weiss making a sound that was technically not a laugh at something Yang said. And the night around them was quiet now, the grim gone, the battle done, the eastern line intact. He looked at the sky. Remnant stars were different from home stars. He'd looked at them enough times in 3 months to know that. Different patterns, different densities, the particular foreign quality of a sky that had never been the sky of his childhood. He looked at them and thought about the crystal, about the door he'd refused, about what was behind him and not through any bridge. The Kurama embers pulsed once, low and warm, deep in the network. He pressed his hand briefly to the seal on his stomach, the spiral, the characters, the thing that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. Yeah, he thought. I know, me too. 3 days after the Eastern Line engagement, General Ironwood filed a formal commendation for Team RWBY's defensive performance and sent a separate private communication to Naruto that read, "The seer withdrawal pattern from your position has been flagged by my analysts. We've never observed grim retreat from a single combatant without structural threat justification. Whatever you did out there, if you're willing to document it, I'd like to understand it. I understand if you're not." Ironwood Naruto read the message twice. Then he replied, "I'll explain what I can. Some of it isn't mine to document. It belongs to someone who isn't here to give permission. But the mechanics I can describe. One condition. The documentation stays between us and Ozpin. Nothing into the general intelligence system. The Paladin incident is still recent." He sent it. Then he put the scroll down and went to find RWBY, who was still recovering from the silver eye discharge and had been confined to quarters by Beacon's medical staff, with the specific reluctant compliance of someone who found stillness physically painful. She was sitting on her bed with crescent rows disassembled on the floor in front of her, performing the maintenance ritual she used when she needed something to do with her hands, and she looked up when he came in. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Like I ran out of something important," she said. "Which I think I did." "The silver eyes take a physical toll," he said. "Energy expenditure from a source your body isn't used to drawing on. It'll get easier the more you do it." He sat on the floor across from her, on the other side of the disassembled weapon. "RWBY." "Yeah." "You didn't control the activation." "No." "It was triggered by seeing Yang down and seeing the seer." He paused. "By the emotional intensity of the moment." "Yes," she said quietly. "Which means the power responds to that," he said. "To genuine feeling, not technique." He looked at her steadily. "In my world, the strongest things I can do, Sage Mode, the Kurama Cloak, they're not technique-dependent either. They're state-dependent. The technique is a path to the state, but the state is what actually matters." He paused. "Your silver eyes are going to be incredible, but getting them reliably is going to mean learning to access what you felt in that moment without needing the crisis to produce it." RWBY looked at him across Crescent Rose's disassembled components. "That sounds hard," she said. "It is," he said, "but you're not going to be working on it alone." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached across the weapon components and hit him in the knee very lightly, the Ruby Rose equivalent of a Yang shoulder, punch, affection expressed through contact because words weren't always sufficient. "Okay," she said. "Deal." He stayed for an hour, watching her reassemble Crescent Rose, and then he went back to his quarters and sat on his bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about what was coming. Salem's probe had been a test. He told Ozpin that before it happened. The probe had served its purpose. She'd mapped the defensive response, identified the gap, filling assets, and collected a significant data point about his decision, making when he refused the crystal. She'd also seen the Kurama cloak. Whatever the ember-eyed woman had been relaying back through their communication channel, she'd seen the seer's response, the chakra light, the retreat. He'd given her something new to incorporate into whatever model she was building. He thought about that carefully, the way he thought about all serious threats, not with fear, but with the specific attention that things deserving of respect required. Salem had been doing this for longer than kingdoms. She was patient in ways that were structural rather than practiced. She was intelligent in ways that had been refined across decades of operational experience, and she was interested in him. He thought about the next steps. About Sage Mode, he needed to crack it, needed to learn Remnant's wounded natural energy well enough to work with it rather than around it. About Ruby's silver eyes and the training that would help her access them with intention. About Weiss's semblance and the chakra enhancement effect he'd felt when he'd channeled into her during the warehouse mission, not fully explored yet. About Blake's speed and what it could become with chakra augmentation. About Yang's semblance ceiling and the 43 milliseconds he'd mapped. He had work to do, a lot of it. He looked at the seal on his stomach, the spiral pulsing slow and steady. "I know," he said to the quiet. "I'm getting there." The embers pulsed back. He closed his eyes and went to sleep with the sound of veil below his window, and the roof above him where 4 people were either asleep or moving through their own evenings, and the specific quality of a world that had become, in 3 months of living, something closer to home than he'd had any right to expect. Chapter 6. A new village, a new Hawkage dream. He went back to the cliffs, alone. Not at dawn this time, at dusk, when the light came off the ocean at the angle that turned the water from green to something deeper, and the shadows stretched long from the basalt ledges, and the wind had the particular quality of late afternoon, cold with the memory of warmth still in it. He'd told Ruby where he was going. She'd looked at him with the specific expression she had when she understood something was important enough to not accompany him, which was a maturity in her that he thought she didn't fully give herself credit for. "Come back when it works," she'd said. "If," he'd said. "When," she'd said, with the flat certainty of someone who had decided the outcome and was simply waiting for reality to catch up. He stood on the outermost ledge and looked at the horizon for a long time without beginning anything. 4 months and 11 days since the crater in the Emerald Forest. 4 months and 11 days of Remnant's natural energy brushing against his senses every waking moment, the constant low-grade contact of a world's energy field with his own chakra network. He'd been passive about it, deliberately passive, the way you were passive with something that needed time to adjust to your presence before you asked anything of it. He thought about what the contact had felt like the first time. The wound, the grief, the specific quality of something very old encountering the Kurama essence and recognizing it, not the fox itself, not the specific entity, but the category of it. The ancient, pre-human, fundamental force quality of what Kurama had been. He thought about what Ruby had said on the cliff the first morning. What if the wound you felt is connected to that? Whatever happened that made the world need people with silver eyes? He thought about what Ozpin had told him in the long briefing session 6 weeks ago, when the headmaster had finally decided that Naruto's operational involvement in Remnant's genuine threat picture required complete context. The god of light and the god of darkness. The gift of creation and the gift of destruction, and the humanity that had asked for both and then tried to combine them. Ozpin's own history, the length of it, the weight of it, the specific exhaustion of someone who had been trying to solve a problem for longer than most civilizations lasted. And Salem. What she'd been before she was what she was now. A human woman who had loved something and lost it and responded to the loss by walking into a pool of darkness that unmade death in her, not granting her life exactly, but removing her from the cycle that made life meaningful. The wound in Remnant's natural energy, he thought, was not a scar from Salem's fall. It was older than that. It was the scar from what the gods had done when they'd left, the departure of divine presence from a world built around that presence, the specific damage of an absence that large. The natural energy of Remnant had been calibrated to something that wasn't there anymore, and it had been running on that miscalibration for long enough that the wound had become structural. It recognized the Kurama essence, because the Kurama essence was, at its core, a piece of primordial energy. Not divine, not in the remnant sense, not light or darkness, but fundamental in the way that the tailed beasts had always been fundamental to his world. Pre-human, pre-civilization. The kind of energy that existed before the systems that categorized energy existed. The wound in Remnant's natural energy recognized that the same way a person recognized the shape of a missing piece when something arrived that was the right contour. He closed his eyes. He stopped thinking about it analytically, because analysis was the wrong tool for what he was trying to do. Sage mode wasn't achieved through understanding. It was achieved through becoming, a shift in relationship to the world's energy from observer to participant, from someone who processed the environment to someone who was, for the duration, part of it. He opened himself. The natural energy came in immediately, as it always did, vast, saturated the enormous reserves of a world that had been accumulating for millennia. And beneath it, immediately, the undertow. The wound. Threading through everything, the grief, dark current that ran below Remnant's energy the way bedrock ran below soil. He didn't push back against it this time. He didn't try to filter it. Didn't try to gather the natural energy while avoiding the wounded current, which was what he'd been doing in every previous attempt, trying to skim clean energy off the top and leave the complicated part alone. That was the mistake. The wound wasn't separate from Remnant's natural energy. It was in it, the way a scar was in skin, not the same as the skin, not healthy in the same way, but real, present part of the thing. He let the wound in. It hit his network the same way it had the first time, that full-body systemic response, his chakra coils reacting to the foreign element, the Kurama embers flaring up in the deep center of his network with an intensity that was not combative but present. Here. I'm here. The embers didn't try to filter the wound either. They received it. The way you received news that was heavy and true simultaneously, not absorbing the weight, but making space for it to exist without requiring anything to be different. The wound found the Kurama essence. And this time, instead of the brief probe and recoil of their first contact, something longer happened. The wound moved through the embers slowly, the way water moved through stone, not eroding, not filling, just present, making contact at a depth that was below technique and below intention, down at the level where things simply were what they were. He felt the grief again. Enormous, ancient, structural. The grief of a world whose fundamental relationship had been severed and which had been living with the severing for so long that it had stopped being grief and started being architecture. The shape of absence built into the foundations. He let it move through him. He didn't try to fix it. Didn't try to heal it. He was a shinobi, not a god, and the arrogance of thinking he could repair something this old and this structural in a single afternoon on a cliff would have been genuinely funny if it wasn't also the kind of mistake that got people hurt. He just let it move through, and he moved through it, and somewhere in that mutual passage something happened that he didn't have precise language for. The wound recognized him, not as Kurama. Not as the fox, not as the vessel, not as a specific thing it had encountered before. It recognized him as something that understood what it carried. Something that had its own structural absence, its own severing, its own grief built into foundations, and was still standing, still moving, still here. The natural energy shifted. The undertow that had been fighting his network on every previous attempt stopped fighting. It didn't vanish. The wound didn't close, couldn't close. That wasn't what was happening, but it stopped being resistance and started being contact. The wound and his network coexisting in the same moment, neither one requiring the other to be different. The natural energy flowed. Not the clean, perfectly balanced inflow of Myabokuzen, the Toad Mountain's refined reserves. This was wilder, denser, carrying that undertow throughout, but no longer hostile because of it. The physical and spiritual and natural energies began to combine in his network the way they were supposed to, the triple synthesis, the alchemy that produced Sage mode, but the result was different from his world's version. The pigmentation came first, the way it always did, but not the orange and black of toad sage markings. Something else. Something that was his own, specific to the combination of his chakra and this world's energy and the wound's recognition that had made the combination possible. Dark rings around his eyes, darker than toad markings, the specific deep gray, black of old stone. And inside them something that was not quite orange and not quite silver, but lived in the space between those two colors. The space between what the fox had been and what Ruby's eyes contained when the old power moved through them. He opened his eyes. The world was extraordinary. Sage mode expanded perception in ways that were difficult to describe to people who hadn't experienced it. Not vision, exactly, because it wasn't limited to light, and not the chakra, sensing he was already capable of, which was a skill he'd developed through training and practice. This was something more immediate and less mediated. The environment existed around him with a completeness that normal perception couldn't access. The stone under his feet had its own quality, its own accumulated presence. The ocean below was not just water, it was water and time and the specific way this world's gravity held it, and the wound threading through its depths like a vein. The grim. He felt them. Not the way he felt life, the warm, present, specific quality of living energy. He felt them the way you felt a whole. Through the specific displacement of what surrounded them, the way their null, life quality organized the natural energy around them into the patterns of something avoided. He could feel 3 separate grim presences in the forest behind him at ranges that his baseline sensing couldn't have reached. And something else. Something vast and very far away, in a direction that wasn't a compass direction, that registered not as life and not as null, life, but as something that the wound in Remnant's natural energy pulled toward the way water pulled toward a drain. Something that the wound recognized the way a scar recognized the instrument that made it. He didn't pursue it. He filed it, noted the direction, closed the extended perception down to a manageable range. Later. Understanding that fully was a later problem. He held the sage mode for 17 minutes. Not because that was his limit. He couldn't determine his limit from a first successful attempt. And pushing to find a ceiling on your first access to a new mode was the kind of decision that produced cautionary tales. He held it for 17 minutes because 17 minutes was enough to fully map the quality of the synthesis. To understand what the remnant, specific sage mode was and wasn't. To begin the process of making it something he could access with intention, rather than requiring the exact emotional and energetic conditions of this specific afternoon. Then he let it recede. The world went back to its normal perceptual range. The stone went back to being stone. The ocean went back to being water. The grim presences faded from immediate awareness to the low, grade baseline he always maintained. He exhaled. Then he sat down on the basalt ledge and pressed both hands to the stone and let the shaking happen, not from weakness, from the specific trembling of a body that had held something significant and was now processing the aftermath. It passed in 2 minutes. He breathed through it. Then he stood up, turned around and walked back to Beacon. He had work to do. The next 3 weeks were the most productive of his time in Remnant. He drilled the Sage mode access daily, extending the hold time and reducing the setup requirements, working toward the point where the synthesis could be achieved quickly enough to be tactically viable, rather than requiring extended preparation. By day 8, he could achieve it in 4 minutes. By day 15, 90 seconds. By day 21, he could drop into the Remnant Sage mode in the time it took to draw a breath and commit. The perception range in Sage mode extended to approximately 6 kilometers at full sensitivity, enough to map the grim population in Beacon's surrounding territory comprehensively and update the picture in real time. He shared the data with Osbin, who shared it with Ironwood through the information sharing agreement, and the intelligence quality improvement was sufficient that Ironwood's response was a message containing 2 sentences. "This is extraordinary. What do you need?" He replied, A complete record of every anomalous Grimm behavioral event in the past 5 years. Anything that doesn't match standard Grimm behavioral models. Ironwood sent 47 files. He read all of them, and the pattern they contained was not subtle once you had the context to read it. Salem had been directing Grimm behavior. Not continuously, not in every location, but at specific points and times that corresponded to the gaps and weaknesses in the kingdom's defensive infrastructure. She'd been doing it for longer than the files covered. The 47 events in 5 years were the visible edge of something that had been running for decades. He mapped it for RWBY. The headmaster looked at the completed picture for a long time without speaking. "She's not trying to destroy the kingdoms," Naruto said. "Not directly. She's trying to weaken them. Slowly, consistently, at a rate that's below the threshold of recognition as a coordinated campaign." He pointed to the map. "She's been reducing the kingdom's capacity to respond to a significant threat for long enough that when the significant threat comes, the response capacity will be gone." "And the significant threat," RWBY said quietly, "is whatever she's been building toward." He paused. "The relics, the maidens. She's been collecting pieces. The Grimm campaign is pressure, keeping the kingdom's attention and resources directed outward toward a threat they understand, while the pieces she actually needs are gathered quietly." He looked at RWBY. "How many relics does she have?" RWBY was quiet for a moment that was too long to be comfortable. "We believe she has access to the knowledge of one," he said, "through a source we haven't been able to identify." Naruto filed that. "And the maidens. The full maiden's power is fragmented," RWBY said in the tone of someone describing a wound. "There is a current bearer, but her connection to the full power is compromised." He paused. "Salem has been aware of this situation for some time." "She's going to move on the full maiden," Naruto said. "Not eventually, soon." The Eastern Line probe was reconnaissance. "The Seer withdrawal told her something about what I can do. The Silver Eye activation told her something about RWBY, and she's been building a complete picture of Beacon's actual response capability as opposed to its theoretical capacity." He looked at the map again. "She's ready." RWBY met his eyes. "I know," the headmaster said. "Then we need to be ready too." The chakra enhancement sessions with Team RWBY started the next morning. He'd thought about the mechanics carefully before proposing it. In his world, chakra transfer was deeply personal. A thing done between people with established trust, because the intimacy of it was not incidental. When he channeled chakra into someone else's system, they felt it at a level below technique. It moved through them the way warmth moved through stone, slowly, thoroughly, leaving the stone different in ways that weren't dramatic, but were real. He'd asked all 4 of them separately before proposing the group sessions, giving each of them the full explanation and the genuine choice. All 4 had said yes, without significant deliberation, which was either a sign of how much they trusted him or a sign that he'd underestimated how much they'd already felt during incidental chakra contact and had been waiting for the formalized version. Possibly both. The first session established the baseline. He started with Weiss, because her semblance was the most technically precise and therefore the most measurable if the chakra enhancement was doing something specific. Weiss's glyph work would show it most clearly. He sat across from her in the training hall, placed his hands over hers, and opened a channel. Not the healing thread he'd used on Yang in the corridor. Something broader. A slow, sustained flow that moved through her aura field and looked for the places where her own energy system had natural interfaces. The glyph structures responded immediately. He felt it through the contact. Her semblance wasn't just technique, it was architecture. The glyphs she produced were genuinely sophisticated constructions, layered with a precision that impressed him even through the filter of working with a fundamentally different energy system. When his chakra touched the glyph structures, it didn't replace her aura, it moved alongside it, reinforcing the structural integrity of the constructions without altering their fundamental design. The glyph she was maintaining strengthened by a visible margin. Then it did something unexpected. The outer edge of the glyph, the boundary where her aura energy was thinnest, where the construction met the surrounding air, developed a quality that hadn't been there before. A sharpness, not decorative. Functional, the way a blade was functional, the specific characteristic of an edge that could separate things. He felt it form and recognized it. His chakra, finding the structural logic of her semblance and enhancing it in the direction its own design was already pointing. Weiss stared at the glyph hovering between them. "It cut through the testing block," she said. The training hall had stone testing blocks for measuring impact force, and the glyph's edge had passed through the nearest one cleanly, without force, simply separating it along the contact line. That's not something glyphs do. "The chakra found where your semblance wants to go," he said. "It's not adding something foreign, it's amplifying what's already there." She looked at the glyph for another moment, then at him with the expression she had when something was confirming a hypothesis she'd been building quietly. "My family's semblance," she said. "The Schnee semblance, the glyphs, the summoning, all of it. There's a theoretical ceiling that no Schnee has ever approached in practice. The grimoire suggests capabilities that haven't been demonstrated in generations." She paused. "Father always said the gap between theory and practice was a matter of insufficient discipline. Was he right?" "No," she said with the flat certainty of someone who had thought about this for years. "The discipline was never the problem. The energy was." She looked at the glyph again. "It required more than the Schnee semblance alone could provide." He understood what she was saying. "The chakra fills the gap." "Yes," she said. Quietly, with the weight of something she'd been carrying that was slightly lighter now, he worked with each of them over the following week. Yang's kinetic absorption threshold, with chakra reinforcement moving through her aura field, extended by 30%. Her semblance could now absorb and convert significantly more force before reaching maximum charge. And the output at full charge was proportionally larger. The 43-millisecond reset window shortened to 29. She tested it on Naruto specifically at his request, and the full output strike moved him 12 feet instead of 6 and left a crater 3 times the size. She was very pleased about this. Blake's speed, already exceptional, became something that the human eye genuinely couldn't track at full extension. The shadow clone technique she used as a decoy mechanism, when augmented with the chakra flowing through her aura, produced multiple simultaneous decoys that had enough energetic presence to briefly fool aura, sensing equipment. Not perfect duplicates, not shadow clones in the true sense, but enough to create genuine uncertainty about her position in ways that her semblance alone couldn't manage. She tested the enhanced speed on a beacon obstacle course and completed it in a time that made the training department's automated systems flag the result as a sensor error. And RWBY. RWBY was different because what he was working with in RWBY wasn't her semblance, or not only her semblance. The silver eyes were something older, something the chakra didn't enhance so much as harmonize with. When he channeled into her aura field, the silver eye capability didn't strengthen in the way the others' semblances had. Instead, it stabilized. The connection between her emotional state and the power's activation became less turbulent, less dependent on the crisis, level intensity that had triggered it on the Eastern Line. It was still emotionally activated, that was fundamental to what it was, he was certain of it, but the emotional threshold lowered. She could access the edges of it in training with practice without needing Yang to be in mortal danger first. The first time she activated it intentionally in a controlled setting, eyes going silver. The light contained to a small, deliberate radius, a single grim training construct dissolving quietly and completely. She looked at him afterward with an expression that was equal parts exhilaration and something that was almost reverence. "I felt it," she said, "like I knew where it was, like I could reach for it." "You'll be able to reach for it faster each time," he said. "The pathway gets worn smooth. Same as any technique." "It doesn't feel like a technique," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't, but it behaves like one in the ways that matter for training it." He paused. Your mother had it too. Ruby's expression changed, softened in a way that had grief in it. Yeah, she said, she did. A pause. Do you think when I use it, does she know? He thought about that honestly. About what he believed, which was something he'd arrived at through 17 years of carrying a tailed beast and having conversations with his own subconscious and fighting a woman who was basically the progenitor of all chakra. I think, he said carefully, that the things that matter to us have a way of reaching further than physics explains, and I think your mother would find it, he searched, appropriate, that it comes out strongest when the people you love need protecting. Ruby was quiet for a moment. Then she hugged him fast and complete, her arms around him and her face pressed against his shoulder, and he held her back and let her have the moment. Okay, she said, pulling back. Again, let's do it again. Ozpin called him to the office on a Tuesday morning with an urgency that was not performed. The headmaster was standing at the strategy table when Naruto arrived, not at his desk, a distinction he'd learned to read as significant. Ozpin stood at his desk when he was processing. He stood at the strategy table when the processing was done. She's moving, Naruto said before Ozpin spoke. Yes, Ozpin said. Tonight, we believe. The intelligence is not confirmed, but the pattern matches, Naruto finished. He moved to the table. The grim activity data was spread across it, the past 48 hours of sensor readings, and the pattern was visible to him in the same way it had been visible in the 47 Atlas files. The same logic, accelerated. She's not probing this time? No, Ozpin's voice was very controlled. The target is Beacon. Naruto looked at the data. The Fall Maiden. We believe she has an asset inside Veil, possibly inside Beacon itself. Ozpin met his eyes. She wants the Fall Maiden's power. She wants to prevent us from completing the transfer to the intended successor. A pause. And she wants to use the chaos of the assault as cover. How many Grim? Based on the accumulation pattern, hundreds, possibly more. Naruto thought about that. Hundreds of directed Grim, not the opportunistic incursion pattern of standard Grim behavior, but a coordinated military deployment, directed by something capable of managing that scale of operational complexity. He thought about the vast, far-away presence he'd felt in Sage mode on the cliff, the thing the wound in Remnant's energy pulled toward. She might be here herself, he said. Ozpin was quiet. Ozpin. She might, he said. Naruto looked at him. You knew this was coming. I've known something like this was coming for a very long time, Ozpin said in the voice of someone carrying decades. The specific shape of it tonight here, this configuration, no, but that the day would come when she stopped maneuvering and began acting in earnest. A long pause. Yes, I've known. Why didn't you? Because knowing that something is inevitable, Ozpin said quietly, and knowing what to do about it are not the same thing. And because the people I would have warned would have spent every day since carrying the weight of the inevitable, and I did not know how to give them that weight. He looked at his hands. It was a failure of judgment, I know that. Naruto stood with that for a moment. He thought about Hiruzen, the third Hokage, who had known Orochimaru was moving and hadn't told the village until it was almost too late. Out of the same complicated calculation, protection versus preparation. The cost of weight carried early versus weight encountered suddenly. He understood the failure even as he understood why it was won. Tonight, he said, what do we have? Ozpin straightened. The weight didn't leave his eyes, but something operational moved behind it. Team CFVY, Team SSSN, several fourth-year teams. The Vital Festival has brought additional huntsmen to Veil. They can be contacted. He paused. And whatever you and Team RWBY constitute? A defense of the school, Naruto said, is the wrong frame. He looked at the table. She wants the Fall Maiden and she wants chaos. The chaos is the Grim, they're the distraction. The Maiden is the objective. He looked up. Defending the perimeter addresses the distraction. What addresses the objective? Ozpin met his eyes. You're suggesting we split the response. I'm suggesting we give her two things to worry about simultaneously, Naruto said. A perimeter defense she can't break cleanly, which requires the full Grim deployment and her full attention on the operational management, and a second problem that she didn't plan for. He paused. Something unexpected. You, Osborne said, and Team RWBY, he said. We go for the asset she has inside, the interior threat, while the exterior response holds the Grim. Osborne was quiet for a moment. If she's here herself, then I deal with that when I need to, Naruto said. I'm not going to plan the battle around a contingency I can't fully assess. I'll deal with what's in front of me. The headmaster looked at him for a long moment. You're very calm, he said. I'm controlled, Naruto said. There's a difference. Something moved in Osborne's expression, old and tired and genuine. Yes, he said. You've mentioned that. He extended his hand. Then let's make sure Beacon is ready. He told Team RWBY in their dormitory room with the door closed straightforwardly, the way he'd told them every difficult thing, directly, without softening, because they were combatants and they deserved the full picture. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Yang said, Tonight. Tonight. How many Grim? Hundreds, maybe more. Coordinated, directed. He paused. This isn't random incursion. This is a military operation. Blake's jaw was set, and the asset inside. Someone with access to Beacon's interior. Someone who's been here long enough to know the layout and the Fall Maiden's location. He looked at them. Could be anyone. Could be someone we've spoken to. Weiss's expression was controlled and cold. And if Salem herself, then we deal with that, he said, but not as the primary plan. Hunting her directly while the Grim assault is active means leaving the exterior defense undermanned. We trust the other teams on the perimeter. He met all four of their eyes in turn. Our job is the interior. Find the asset, protect the Maiden's transfer, contain whatever Salem has inside these walls. And you, RWBY said. She was looking at him with the silver eyes that weren't silver yet, but had the quality of being close to it, the way sky had the quality of being close to rain. I'm everywhere I'm needed, he said. Sage mode gives me the range to track everything in real time. I can coordinate from the interior while you move to contact. He paused. And if something comes that the teams can't handle, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They'd all seen the orange light on the eastern line. Yang nodded once. Short, definite, the nod of someone who had made peace with a situation and was now purely operational. Okay, she said, what do we need? The Grim came at nightfall. Not from one direction, from every direction simultaneously. The coordinated deployment of something that had been staged beyond detection range and released all at once. Naruto felt them arrive in Sage mode before the sensor arrays registered the perimeter breach. Felt the enormous wave of null. Life spreading through the forest toward Vale's walls like a tide, hundreds of individual voids in the world's energy, moving with the specific purpose of directed things. Perimeter breach all sectors, he said, into the calm. Defending teams, engage now. Do not let them reach the walls. He heard the response confirmations. Team CFVY, Team SSSN, the Vital, attending huntsmen who'd been briefed and deployed in the past 6 hours. Glinda's voice cutting through the calm channel with the specific authority of someone who'd been preparing for this moment and was now entirely in her element. He turned inward. Go, he said to Team RWBY. They moved. The interior of Beacon in a simultaneous exterior assault had a quality of cognitive dissonance. The sounds of the battle outside audible through the walls and windows, while the corridors themselves were quiet, lit, normal, with the fragile normality of a space that hadn't yet been reached by what was happening around it. Students who'd been briefed were in designated shelter locations. Staff were at defensive posts. The school had an interior response plan that Ozpin had developed and Glinda had drilled, and it was running. Naruto tracked the exterior battle in Sage mode while moving through Beacon's corridors. Hundreds of individual presences engaging the perimeter defenses, the battle was enormous, the largest Grim deployment he'd felt in Remnant, and it required the full attention of every defending huntsman outside. The perimeter was holding. barely in 3 sectors, not breaking. And inside he felt it before he found it. A presence in the lower levels of Beacon's interior, not grim, not null life, but something that shared the category he'd been developing the sensitivity to recognize. The grim, adjacent energy, the deep long, carried power of someone in Salem's circle. Not the vanguard woman from the warehouse, not the ember-eyed woman from the Eastern Line. Someone new, someone who'd been here for a long time, patient enough to stay still while everything moved around them. Lower levels, he said into the calm. I've got an interior contact, heading down. Ruby's voice, with you in 30 seconds. I'll be faster than that. Stay on comms, he moved. The lower levels of Beacon were operational infrastructure, power systems, maintenance corridors, the specific geography of an institution that required its foundations to be functional without being visible. The presence he was tracking led him through 2 maintenance corridors and a sub-level stairwell to a chamber that was. He checked his mental map of the building. Directly below the facility where the Fall Maiden's transfer apparatus was housed. The woman waiting there was not what he'd expected. Young. 20, perhaps 22, with dark hair and amber eyes and the kind of stillness that came from either profound calm or profound damage, and he couldn't tell from the threshold which one it was. She was standing in the center of the chamber with her arms at her sides, and the energy he'd felt, the grim, adjacent power, was coming from something at her side. A weapon, or what had been a weapon. Crystalline, dark, and resonating with the specific quality he'd come to associate with Salem's instruments, she looked at him. "You're not who she sent," she said. Her voice had something in it that was not quite grief and not quite relief. "I'm who showed up," he said. He moved into the chamber, slowly, reading her with every sense he had. The grim, adjacent power was in the weapon, not in her. She was carrying it, but she wasn't its source. And her own energy signature underneath the weapon's resonance, she had aura. She had semblance energy. She was a huntress, or had been trained as one. And her emotional state, which he could read with the Sage Mode's sensitivity to the world's energy, was not the controlled blankness of a committed operative. She was terrified. "You don't want to be here," he said, her jaw tightened. "My orders aren't what you actually want," he said. "I can feel it. I'm not going to pretend I can't." He took another step into the chamber, hands visible, nothing threatening. "Who has something you care about?" A long silence. The weapon at her side trembled slightly. "My sister," she said finally. They have her. If I don't, they said. "How long?" he said. 3 months, she said, and the word cracked at the end. 3 months, and I've been in here, and they've been telling me she's fine, she'll stay fine if I just. She stopped. "I need to disable the transfer apparatus. That's all I have to do, just disable it, and she comes home." Naruto stood with that. The specific cruelty of it, not asking her to be a weapon, not asking her to fight, just asking her to do one thing, one technical thing, in exchange for someone she loved. The cleanest kind of leverage because it didn't require loyalty or belief, just love used as a mechanism. "She's not going to release your sister," he said gently. "Not because I'm cynical about promises, because Salem doesn't make exchanges, she makes investments. Your sister is leverage. She's more valuable as leverage than as a released prisoner." He paused. "I'm sorry, that's a hard thing to hear." The woman looked at him. The amber eyes were wet. "So what do I do?" she said quietly. "You put down the weapon," he said. "And you tell me everything you know about where your sister is. And I make a different kind of promise to you, not from Salem, not with leverage attached. Just, I will find your sister, and when I find her, she comes home." "You can't know that," she said. "I've been doing this for a while," he said. "People I promised to bring home come home." He met her eyes. "I've never been great at knowing when something's impossible. It's caused me problems. But in this specific context, I'm choosing to believe it's useful." A long moment, the weapon at her side lowered. She sat down on the chamber floor slowly, like her legs had made the decision before the rest of her did, and put her face in her hands. He crossed the chamber and crouched in front of her and let her have a moment before he said quietly, "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything." Behind him, Ruby appeared in the doorway. She read the scene in 2 seconds, met his eyes over the woman's head, and nodded once, understanding, competent, completely trustworthy. She moved to the woman's other side and sat down and said, in her own particular way that was neither performance nor technique, but simply Ruby being Ruby. "Hey, you're okay, we've got you." The woman looked at her. At the red cloak, the silver eyes, the absolute uncomplicated presence of it. Then she started talking. The full Maiden's transfer completed 40 minutes later, with the apparatus intact. The exterior battle broke an hour after that, not because the Grimm were exhausted. Grimm didn't exhaust in the conventional sense, but because the direction intelligence driving them went silent. The coordination failed. Grimm, without direction, defaulted to their natural behavior, which was responsive to negative emotion rather than strategic, and the emotional quality of a successful defense was not the kind of negative emotion that drove Grimm forward. They scattered. Naruto stood on Beacon's roof in the aftermath and felt them scatter in sage mode. Hundreds of null, life presences dispersing through the forest and countryside. The tide going out. The world's energy settling back into something closer to its baseline, wounded quiet. The vast, far-away presence he'd felt before, the thing the wound in Remnant's energy pulled toward, was gone. Not retreated. It had been there and now it wasn't, the way a hand removed from water left no impression. She'd been here. Present in the sense that something sufficiently connected to Remnant's fundamental damage could be present at a distance. Watching. And when the interior operation had failed, when the asset had put down the weapon and started talking, she'd withdrawn. Not from defeat. From the recalculation that followed when a plan's outcome became determined, she'd watched. She'd assessed. She'd withdrawn. He thought about the crystal he'd refused, about the data point that refusal had given her, about the model she was building, she's learning, he thought. Every engagement, every contact, every refusal, and every choice. She's updating the model, which meant he needed to be something the model couldn't predict. He thought about that for a while on the roof, in the quiet aftermath. And then he thought about something else, about the woman in the chamber and her sister, and the promise he'd made, and the specific quality of a promise that had no leverage attached to it. He was going to need to find a sister. He could do that. Ozpin's debrief lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, what they had was a comprehensive picture of the night's events. The exterior assault, the interior operation, the failed transfer disruption, the grim dispersal. The asset was in Vale PD custody with Ozpin's direct advocacy for leniency given the circumstances. The intelligence she'd provided about Salem's interior operational network was significant, not complete, but the most direct window into Salem's methodology that Beacon had ever had. And one other thing. She was here, Naruto said at the end. Not physically but present, in a way I can feel but can't fully explain. She was watching the whole thing. Ozpin sat very still. Are you certain? As certain as I can be about something I can't see. He paused. She wanted to see how we responded, not just to the exterior assault, to the interior operation specifically. She wanted to see what I'd do with the asset in the chamber. And what did you do? I made a promise, he said. Ozpin looked at him. About the sister. Yes. That's a significant commitment based on very limited intelligence about the sister's location. Yeah, Naruto agreed. It is. Do you intend to honor it? He looked at Ozpin steadily. I don't make promises I don't intend to honor. It's the single policy I've never deviated from. He paused. It's also why I'm careful about what I promise. Ozpin held his gaze for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised Naruto. He laughed. Short, quiet, the genuine laugh of someone who hadn't expected to find something funny and was slightly moved that they had. Very well, he said. I'll assign what intelligence resources I can to locating the sister. Good. He stood. And Ozpin? Yes. She's going to try something different next time. The model she's building, it's looking for the approach I don't expect. Whatever she does next won't look like tonight. He paused. Which means we need to be thinking about what we can do that she also doesn't expect. Ozpin looked at him. Do you have something in mind? I'm working on it, he said. He left the office, took the elevator down, walked out into Beacon's grounds in the early morning. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, that particular remnant dawn that came in purples and greens before the blue. The aurora quality that he'd never get entirely used to seeing and had stopped trying to get used to because the not getting used to, it was something he wanted to keep. The grounds were damaged. Stone cracked from perimeter impacts, sections of the outer wall requiring repair, one of the automated turret systems completely destroyed. The cost of a held line, within recoverable parameters as the official assessments would say. He walked through it to the base of the tower and sat on the steps and put his face in his hands and let himself, for a short controlled moment, feel the weight of the night fully, the grim assault. The interior operation. The vast presence watching from somewhere the sage mode could feel but not see. The promise to a woman whose sister was in Salem's infrastructure somewhere. The picture of what was coming. What Ozpin hadn't fully named but which the 47 files and the grim movement maps and the logic of the relics and the maidens all pointed toward. The genuine, total existential scale of what Salem was building toward. He held that weight for the controlled moment, then he put it somewhere that wasn't gone but wasn't in his hands. He heard footsteps on the stone. He didn't look up. Ruby sat next to him on the steps, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his arm. She didn't say anything. Yang sat on his other side, the warm constant of her presence that he'd calibrated to. He felt Blake settle above him on the step behind, and Weiss stood 3 steps down and turned to face away, looking at the damaged grounds with the expression of someone keeping watch. They stayed that way for a while. We held it, Ruby said eventually. We held it, he agreed, Beacon still standing. Yeah, and the Fall Maiden transfer is complete. Yes, a pause. And you made a promise about a sister. Yang said in the tone of someone who had heard about the promise and had opinions. Yes, good, Yang said. I like promises. We should find her. That's the plan, he said. Another pause. Naruto, Weiss said from 3 steps below. She didn't turn. You said she was here watching? Yes. What does that mean? For next time? He thought about how to answer honestly. It means she has better information about what we can do than she had yesterday. It means the next approach will be designed around what she learned tonight. He paused. It also means she saw the sage mode, the silver eyes, the semblance enhancements, the things I've been building with you. Another pause. And she saw me make a promise with no leverage attached, which is the part I think will confuse her model the most. Why? Blake said from above. Because she's spent a very long time in a world where everything has leverage attached, he said. Where every action is strategic and every relationship is instrumental. She's been running that model for longer than the kingdoms have existed. He looked at the damaged grounds, at the cracked stone and the broken turret, at Beacon still standing in the first light. The thing that doesn't fit the model isn't power. She's seen power. She's seen maiden power and relic power and things much older than any of that. He paused. What she hasn't seen, or not in a long time, is someone doing something purely because they said they would. A long silence. That's what confuses her, Ruby said quietly. I think so. He looked at the aurora, dawn sky. The wound in this world's energy, the thing I felt when I was learning sage mode, the grief that's built into the foundations, I think it's the shape of what's been missing. Not power, not strategy. He struggled to find the right words for it, because the right words were not particularly his native language. He'd always been better at demonstrating things than articulating them. Something that acts without calculation, something that builds without needing the building to be useful first. He thought about what he'd told the asset in the chamber. Just, I will find your sister. When I find her, she comes home. He thought about what he'd been building here for 4 months, not strategically, not as cover or operational resource, but simply because these were the people in front of him and they were worth building something with. He thought about what he'd said on the roof the night he'd told them what this was. The only authority I've ever really accepted is people I'd take a hit for. She called it a village, he said. The Vanguard woman, she said, choose your village carefully. She meant it as a warning, Blake said. I know, he said. She wasn't wrong that it's a choice with costs. He looked at the damage around them, at the sky, at the four of them in the early morning light. But I think the thing she didn't understand is that, for me, the village was never a strategy. It was always just the people. The specific people. And once you have the specific people, the choosing is already done. The aurora, dawn, continued its slow progress, green and purple giving way to blue. Below them, Vale was waking up, the city that didn't know how close the night had come to going differently, that was moving through its morning routines with the ordinary confidence of people inside walls they trusted. He thought about hidden villages, about Konoha, about the specific relationship between a place and the people who made it real. Not the buildings, not the walls, the people who woke up in it and went to sleep in it and chose every day to be part of it. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what comes next." "The sister," Yang said. "That's first." "Yes," he paused. "But beyond that, Salem's going to try something we don't expect, which means I need to be doing something she can't model. Not a technique, not a power level." He thought about the six-path sage mode, the thing he hadn't accessed yet in Remnant, the ceiling of what he could do that he'd been preserving deliberately. Not from fear, but from the understanding that there were modes of being that should be earned rather than deployed. "There's a version of what I can do," he said slowly, "that I haven't touched here yet. In my world, it required accepting something, not just a power, but a responsibility, a relationship to the world that was larger than I could hold easily." "What stopped you?" RWBY said. He thought about it honestly. "I wasn't sure if this was my world to hold it for," he said. "I'm from somewhere else. The things I carry, Kurama's essence, the sage capacity, the six paths power, they were given to me in the context of my world for my world. Using them here felt like..." He searched, like using a key in a door it wasn't cut for, a pause. "And now," Weiss said, he looked at the damaged grounds, at Beacon's standing, at the sky that was a color his home sky had never been, that he'd stopped trying to get used to because he wanted to keep noticing it. "Now I think," he said, "that the key fits." He went to the cliffs that evening, not alone this time. RWBY walked beside him without being asked, which was how she did most things, not requiring invitation, simply present when presence was the right thing. They walked in comfortable silence through Beacon's grounds and the forest path and out to the basalt ledges, and the ocean was gray, green in the dusk light, and the wind was cold, and all of it was as familiar as his own hands. He stood at the outer ledge. He thought about what six-path sage mode had required in his world. Not just the Kurama power and the sage mode combined, those were the technical elements. The thing it actually required was the acceptance of the world as something worth being responsible for, not because you had to be, not because there was no choice, but because you looked at it, the specific, imperfect, wounded, trying world in front of you, and decided that it was worth the cost of caring about it completely. He'd made that decision once before, in a different world, and it had cost him, and it had been worth every unit of the cost. He looked at Remnant's sky. He thought about Ozpin carrying centuries of failure and continuing, about RWBY's silver eyes and the grief that powered them and the love that aimed them, about Yang who moved toward things instead of away from them, about Weiss who showed love through precision and investment, about Blake who told the truth about herself one piece at a time and trusted it to land. He thought about a wound in the world's energy that had recognized something in him and let him through. He thought about what the wound was the shape of. What absence that large could only be something that had left, something that had been present and then wasn't, and the world had been living with the shape of that departure ever since. He reached inward. The Kurama embers, deep and steady, warm as they always were. "Hey," he thought. The embers pulsed. "I'm going to try something," he thought. "I need you for it." The embers pulsed again. Not a question. An answer. "Yeah," they said, in the way that wasn't language but was communication. "I know. I've been waiting." He opened himself to Remnant's natural energy. Immediate now, practiced. The wounded current coming in alongside the clean flow and coexisting with both, and simultaneously drew on the Kurama embers fully. Not the partial access of the cloak, but the deep totality of what remained. The vast primordial essence dissolved into his network. The two combined. The technical term in his world was six-path sage mode, the synthesis of sage energy and nine, Tails chakra and the six paths power that had been granted at the threshold of a different kind of acceptance. But what happened on the basalt cliff over Remnant's ocean was not exactly the same as what had happened in his world, because the inputs were not exactly the same. The sage energy was Remnant's, wounded, vast, grief, dark and ancient. The Kurama essence was what it had always been, primordial, pre-human, the oldest kind of living force. And the six paths power was, he thought about a god of light and a god of darkness who had left. He thought about the wound that their leaving had made. He thought about the specific quality of a world that had been calibrating to an absence for so long that the calibration had become its character. And he thought, I'm here, not claiming to be what the gods had been, not filling the absence that was arrogance beyond any arrogance he'd ever permitted himself, but acknowledging it, being present to it, the way you could be present to someone else's grief without pretending you could remove it, just there, just real, just not adding to the abandonment. The six-path sage mode came in like a second dawn, different from his world's version, same category, different color. The markings that appeared on his face were not the cross-shaped pupils of his world's version. They were deeper, more complex, the dark stone rings of the remnant sage mode, and inside them the color that lived between orange and silver, and around them something new, lines that followed the structure of the Uzumaki spiral in a pattern he hadn't seen before, didn't recognize, hadn't designed. As if the mode had consulted something in his heritage and in Remnant's wound simultaneously and produced a synthesis. His hair moved in a wind that wasn't from the ocean. His perception expanded to a range he had no scale for. The whole of Vale and beyond it, every life, every null life, every flowing of Remnant's natural energy, including the deep bedrock of the wound, all of it present at once in a comprehensive clarity that was overwhelming in the way that genuine scale was always overwhelming when you encountered it honestly, and at the farthest edge of that perception, the vast, far-away presence. The thing the wound pulled toward. Salem, not close. Not threatening in this moment, but present in the way that something connected to a wound was always present to whatever could feel the wound. She felt him. He knew it because the presence, vast and old and utterly patient, paused. The quality of it changed for a fraction of a second in the way that something surprised changed, the interruption of a long, running pattern by an input it hadn't anticipated. Then it withdrew again. Slowly. Deliberately recalibrating. He held the six-path sage mode for 11 minutes, which was what he had. It would extend with practice, as everything extended with practice. He let it recede carefully, layer by layer, the perception range contracting from the vast sweep back to the manageable, the markings fading, the light going. He sat down on the basalt ledge. Ruby sat beside him. Well, she said, he thought about the quality of what he'd felt at full range. The completeness of it. Remnant spread out in his perception like a map that was also an experience. Every part of it present simultaneously. The wound and the life and the null. Life and the flowing energy and the vast distance of what Salem was, and the specific close warmth of four people he'd build anything for. It works, he said. I knew it would, she said. You always know things will work, he said. Because they usually do, she said, with the comfortable certainty of someone who had tested this hypothesis and found it reliable. Then, quieter, what did it feel like, the whole thing at once? He thought about how to answer that honestly. Like being responsible for something, he said. Not burdened by it, just responsible, the way you're responsible for a place you've decided is home. He looked at the ocean. I've felt it before, the difference is the place. Ruby looked at the ocean too. This is home, she said. Not a question. He thought about the roof and the cliff and the training hall and the corridor and the dormitory room and Ozpin's office and Vale's lights from above and the aurora, dawn sky that he'd stopped trying to get used to. He thought about the embers deep in his network, warm and patient and present. Yeah, he said. "This is home." The ocean moved below them, and the sky deepened toward evening, and Beacon stood behind them with its damaged grounds and its intact walls and its people moving through the ordinary business of an extraordinary place. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the horizon and thought about what came next. Salem was recalibrating. She'd felt the six-path sage mode, felt him feel her, and she was updating the model with the new data point. She'd know now that the power was real and not theoretical. She'd know the range of his perception at full extension. She'd know that finding him from a distance was now a bilateral proposition, and she'd know something else. Something the data point of the cliff would tell her if she was as perceptive as everything suggested she was. He'd accessed the six paths mode here, in Remnant. In a world that wasn't his, using energy that carried the grief of a wound that wasn't his wound, for people he hadn't known 5 months ago, which meant he wasn't a traveler anymore, which meant he wasn't going back, not because he couldn't, not because the door was permanently closed, but because back had become a direction rather than a destination, and the destination was here and had been for a while now, and he was finally calling it what it was. He would find the sister. He would train Ruby's silver eyes until she could reach for them like a hand in familiar darkness. He would help Weiss touch the ceiling her family's semblance had never reached. He would spar with Yang until 40. 3 milliseconds became 30, and then 20, and then something even she couldn't fully predict. He would sit on rooftops with Blake and talk about the things that mattered and read the books she passed him and leave notes in the margins that she'd keep. He would learn everything Salem knew about directing Grimm and use it against her. He would map the relics and the maidens and the specific geometry of what Salem was building and find the place where it could be interrupted. He would carry the wound in Remnant's natural energy with the same care he'd carried the wounds of his own world, not healing them, because you didn't heal things that large, but being present to them, honestly, without flinching. He would build a village, not Konoha, not the Hidden Leaf, not the Ninja Academy and the Hawkage Monument and the Ramen Stand and the training grounds where he'd become what he was. Something different. Something specific to this world and these people and the particular configuration of this moment. But a village in the sense that mattered, the people who woke up in it and slept in it and chose it every day because it was worth choosing. He thought about what the Vanguard woman had said on the Eastern Line. Choose your village carefully. The one you build here will cost you more than the one you left, he'd chosen. He knew the cost. He thought it was probably worth every unit of it. Later that night on the roof that had become their geography, all 5 of them under Remnant's aurora sky, Weiss said, "We need a plan, a real one, for what comes after finding the sister after the next assault, after all of it." "I know," he said. "Salem isn't going to stop," Blake said. "No." He agreed. "She isn't." "So what's the plan?" Yang said. He looked at the sky, at the particular aurora that he'd stopped trying to get used to, at the stars that weren't home stars and had become, over 5 months of looking at them, entirely his own. "We build something she can't break," he said. "Not a wall, not a weapon, something she doesn't know how to model because it doesn't run on the logic she's been using for centuries." He paused. "We figure out the relics, we protect the maidens. We find the people in her network who are there because she has something they love, the way the asset tonight was there, and we give them a different option." He paused again. "And when the time comes for the direct confrontation, and it will come, we make sure it happens on ground we've chosen, not ground she's chosen." "That's a lot of plan," Ruby said. "It's a direction," he said. "Plans come after directions." "Is that a shinobi saying?" Weiss said. "It's a me saying." He said, "I find directions easier to commit to than plans. Plans get complicated. Directions stay true." Yang leaned back on the roof with her hands behind her head, looking at the sky. "What's the direction?" He looked at the aurora, at the 4 of them, at the city below and the school behind him and the damaged grounds that would be repaired and the walls that it held. "Forward," he said. The roof was quiet. Then Ruby laughed, short and real and entirely Ruby, and said, "That works." Yang grinned. Blake's mouth did the thing that was adjacent to a smile. Weiss exhaled something that was almost exasperation and almost affection and mostly just Weiss. Below them, Vale went about its night. Above them, the aurora moved in its long, slow patterns, green and purple, then blue, then the dark between them. The world was wounded and old and difficult and extraordinary, and it was his world now, for all the cost that meant. He sat on the roof of Beacon's east wing with 4 people he would take any hit for, and looked at the sky that had become his sky, forward. "Yeah," said the embers, deep and warm and present as gravity. "Let's go."